and wearing a straw hat. He was carrying a butterfly net. "My name is Jack Stapleton," he said, "a friend of Dr. Mortimer. He has told me about you. Has Mr. Sherlock Holmes come to any conclusion yet? And may I ask if Mr. Holmes himself will be visiting Devon?" "I assure you that I am here simply on a visit to my friend Sir Henry," I said, surprised by so many questions. "Excellent," Stapleton said. "You are right to be careful. I shall not mention the matter again. Now, come home with me to Merripit House and meet my sister." As we walked together, he pointed to some hills in the distance. "Be careful if you walk over there," he said. "There's a terrible bog just in front of the hills, Grimpen Mire. It will suck you down in seconds. I know a safe path through it. I often go into the hills to catch my butterflies." It ran down my spine as he spoke. Suddenly, a long, low moan filled the air. It became a loud roar, then a sad murmur. "What is it?" I asked him. "People here say it's the hound of the Baskervilles calling for its victims," Stapleton told me. "I've heard it before, but never so loud. But I don't believe such nonsense. It's probably just a bird." As we came near to the house, Miss Stapleton came out to meet us. To my amazement, she came up to me and whispered, "Go back. Go straight back to London. Never set foot on this moor again." I could only stare at her in stupid surprise until her brother joined us. "I was telling Sir Henry that it was rather late for him to see the true beauties of the moors," Miss Stapleton said quickly. "My name is Dr. Watson," I told her. "I am Sir Henry's friend." Miss Stapleton looked at me angrily and went into the house. I did not stay with them long. On my return journey, I came across Miss Stapleton again, sitting on a rock by the side of the path. "I apologize for my stupid mistake earlier," she said. "Please forget what I said." "But I am Sir Henry's friend," I said. "Tell me what the danger is." "You know the story of the hound?" "I do not believe in such nonsense," I said. "But I do," Miss Stapleton replied. "Please take Sir Henry away from this dangerous place." She turned and disappeared in a few minutes among the scattered boulders, and I, full of fear, went on my way to Baskerville Hall. Chapter 4. Dr. Watson's Reports. Baskerville Hall, October 13th. My dear Holmes, let me tell you about the strange events of last night. You know that I am not a very sound sleeper, and since I have been on guard in this house, my sleep has been lighter than ever. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard someone creep past my door. I peeped out and saw Barrymore, barefoot and carrying a candle. I followed him to one of the empty rooms at the end of the corridor. In the room, Barrymore crouched by the window. He put out his candle and stood staring into the blackness of the moor. There is some secret business going on in this house of gloom. This morning, I told Sir Henry what I had seen, and we have made a plan which should make my next report more interesting. Tonight, we shall sit up all night to see if Barrymore visits the room again. Dr. Watson. Baskerville Hall, October 15th. My dear Holmes, things have now become clearer and more complicated at the same time. Yesterday morning, Sir Henry set off for a walk on the moors. He would not let me go with him, but when he had been gone some time, I decided to go after him. I saw him from the path, in the company of Miss Stapleton. Then a wisp of green floating in the air caught my eye, and I saw Jack Stapleton carrying his butterfly net. He was much closer to them than I was. When he saw them, he seemed to be angry. His sister left Sir Henry and walked off with her brother. I ran down the hill to speak to Sir Henry. "Do you think Jack Stapleton is mad?" he asked me. "I don't think so," I said. "Why do you ask?" "He does not want me even to touch the tip of his sister's fingers," he said bitterly. "I want to marry her, Watson. I love her. But her brother is mad with anger. Why, oh why?" I was puzzled. However, our minds were put at rest that same afternoon. Stapleton came to Baskerville Hall to apologize for his behavior. He said he could not bear the thought of losing his dear sister. So that is one of our little mysteries cleared up. Now what about Barrymore? We did not see him until the second night. He was crouching at the same window just as before. Sir Henry walked straight into the room. "What are you doing here, Barrymore?" he asked. "Nothing, sir," Barrymore replied. He was so upset that he could hardly speak. "I am making sure that the window is fastened." "Tell the truth," Sir Henry said sternly. "Who is out there?" "Don't ask me, Sir Henry, don't ask me," Barrymore said. "It is not my secret, and I cannot tell it." "You should be ashamed of yourself," Sir Henry shouted. "Your family has lived with mine for over 100 years, and now you plot against me?" "No, no, sir. No, not against you." It was a woman's voice, and Mrs. Barrymore, paler and more horror-struck than her husband, was standing at the door. "It's my doing, Sir Henry, all mine," she said. "He's done nothing except for my sake, and because I asked him." She paused. "My brother has escaped from the prison on the moor. Now he's starving out there. The signal is to tell him that there's food here for him." Sir Henry was a kind man, and he promised not to say anything more. But when the Barrymores had left, he was worried. "The Stapletons may not be safe from this prisoner," he said. "Dr. Watson, will you come on to the moor with me and see if we can catch the man ourselves?" I agreed, and we set off into the darkness. "What would Holmes say?" Sir Henry laughed. "Out on the moor at this time of the night?" As if in answer to his words, a strange cry rose from the moor, the cry I had already heard on the Grimpen Mire. It came with the wind through the silence of the night, rising to a howl, then dying away in a sad moan. Again and again it came, wild and terrifying. "Watson," said Sir Henry, "it was the cry of a hound, the hound of the Baskervilles." My blood ran cold in my veins as I heard the terror in his voice. "Is it possible I may be in danger from evil?" he asked me. It was one thing to laugh about it in London, and another to stand out here in the darkness of the moor and hear such a cry. That sound froze my blood, Watson. But he refused to turn back. We stumbled slowly in the darkness until we came to a flickering candle stuck in a rock. Then we saw the prisoner, but he ran off as soon as he saw us. We ran after him until we could run no more. Then we turned back for Baskerville Hall. As I glanced back, Holmes, I saw a man standing on a rock in the moonlight. Not the convict, but a tall, thin man. He stood with his arms folded, his head bowed. Then he disappeared before Sir Henry could see him. I wish you could come down to Devon to shed some light on this. Dr. Watson. Chapter 5. Dr. Watson's Diary. October 16th. A dull and foggy day, with a drizzle of rain. It is sad both outside and in. I feel that there is danger all around. Barrymore was angry with us for hunting his brother-in-law. We promised at last not to tell the police. Barrymore was so happy to hear this that he told us more about the night of the murder. I should have said it before, he told us, but I only found out a long time after the inquest. I've never breathed a word about it. Do you know how Sir Charles died? I asked him. No, sir, I don't know that, Barrymore replied, but I do know why he was at the gate to the moor. It was to meet a woman. And the woman's name? I asked. I can't give you the name, sir, but I can give you the initials. They were L.L. How do you know this? Sir Henry asked. Your uncle received a letter on the morning of the day he died, Barrymore explained. It was from a village called Coombe Tracey. Sir Charles burned it, but I saw the remains of it in the fireplace. I could just read the last line. Please, please, as you are a gentleman, burn this letter and be at the gate by 10 o'clock. L.L. The Hound of the Baskervilles, 2. Arthur Conan Doyle. Thank you, Barrymore, Sir Henry said. You can go. He turned to me. Well, Watson, he said, what do you think of that? It seems to leave the darkness rather blacker than before, I said. I shall tell Holmes. He may come down here. October 17th. All day the rain has poured down, rustling down the ivy. I thought of the poor prisoner out on the moor and that strange man standing against the moon. In the evening, I walked on the moor, the rain beating upon my face and the wind whistling in my ears. Heavy, slate-colored clouds hung low over the hills. On my way back, Dr. Mortimer passed me. Do you know anybody with the initials L.L.? I asked him. He thought for a few moments. Laura Lyons, he told me at last. Have you met a man called Frankland yet? He lives up on the moor about 4 miles from here. Laura Lyons is his daughter. She married against his wishes. Then her husband left her. She's had a pretty bad time, I hear. Jack Stapleton and Sir Charles have both tried to help her. They bought her a typewriter, and she earns a living in Coombe Tracey. I hurried back to Baskerville Hall for dinner. When Barrymore brought my coffee, I asked him if his brother-in-law was still on the moor. I think so, sir, he told me. Somebody's taken the food, unless it was the other man who took it. I stared at Barrymore in surprise. You know that there is another man, then? I asked. Yes, sir, Barrymore replied. My brother-in-law told me. He's living in one of those old stone huts out there. A boy takes him food. I don't like it, Dr. Watson. I tell you straight, sir, that I don't like it. He stared out of the window at the rain-lashed moor. There's foul play out there somewhere, he whispered. What's the stranger out there waiting for? When Barrymore had gone, I walked over to the window and looked out. What must it be like out there on such a wild night? What hatred makes a man hide up there on the moor? I feel that he lies at the center of this mystery, I told myself, and tomorrow I shall find him. Chapter 6. The Man on the Moor. I decided to visit Laura Lyons first. She was sitting at her typewriter when I was shown to her room. I thought she was very beautiful, except for a hard look in her eyes. Why have you come here? She asked coldly. It is about Sir Charles Baskerville, I replied. You knew him, didn't you? He was very kind to me," she said. "Without his help, I should have starved." "Did you ever write to him?" I asked. She looked at me with an angry gleam in her hazel eyes. "Once or twice to thank him for his kindness," she said at last. "Did you ever write to Sir Charles, asking him to meet you?" I asked. Mrs. Lyons looked angry again. "Really, sir, this is a very strange question," she said. "I am sorry, madam, but I must repeat it." "Then I answer, certainly not," she said. "Not on the very day of Sir Charles's death?" I asked. The lady turned deadly pale. "No," she whispered. "No." "Please, please, as you are a gentleman, burn this letter and be at the gate by 10 o'clock," I said slowly. She almost fainted as she heard my words. "I did write that letter," she said quietly, "but I have no reason to be ashamed of it." "What happened when you got there?" I asked her. "I didn't go," she said. "You must believe me. I am telling the truth. When I heard about poor Sir Charles's death, I couldn't say anything. I was afraid that I would be blamed." "I believe you," I said gently. I left her and returned across the moor to Baskerville Hall. I stopped for a moment and stared at the huts dotted on the hillside. "I shall go back to the place where I saw the man in the moonlight," I thought, "and then I'll explore every hut on the moor until I find him." I set off again. Good luck was with me, because on the way I met Laura's father, Frankland. I did not like him, but I stopped to talk. I wanted to find out as much as I could. "I know where that escaped prisoner is," he told me excitedly. "I've seen a boy taking food to him every day." "How do you know this?" I asked in surprise. "You shall judge for yourself, sir," he laughed. "I have a fine telescope on the roof of my house." I followed Frankland eagerly and looked through his telescope. Sure enough, after a short time, I saw a small boy trudging slowly up a hill close to where I had seen the man in the moonlight. I made my excuses and left as soon as possible. The sun was already sinking when I reached the top of the hill. There was no sound and no movement anywhere, except for one silent bird in the air above me. I looked at the huts below me. Only one of them has a roof, I thought. That is where the stranger must be hiding. I made my way slowly towards the hut, my heart thudding. I put my hand on my revolver and walked to the door. Then I looked quickly inside. There was nobody there. I stared at the pile of blankets, at the remains of food, then at a sheet of paper I read, "Dr. Watson has gone to Coombe Tracy." Was this man following me, not Sir Henry? I shall not leave this hut until I know, I thought. I sat down in the dark hut and waited with growing terror. And then at last I heard him. Far away came the sharp clink of a boot hitting a stone. Then another and another. Coming nearer and nearer, I shrank back. A shadow fell across the opening of the hut. Chapter 7. The Net Closes In. "It is a lovely evening, my dear Watson," said a well-known voice. "I really think that you will be more comfortable outside than in." For a moment or two, I sat breathless, hardly able to believe my ears. That cold, careful voice could only belong to one man in the world. "Holmes!" I cried. "Holmes!" "Come out," he said, "and please be careful with the revolver." I went outside. Holmes was sitting on a stone. He looked thin and tired, but his face was bronzed by the sun and the wind. In his tweed suit and cap, he looked like any other tourist visiting the moor. "I was never more glad to see you," I said, shaking his hand. "Or more astonished, eh?" he asked. "Well, yes," I said. "I am surprised, too," he told me. "I had no idea that you were on my trail until I was almost inside the hut just now." "You saw my footprint?" I asked. "No, Watson," he replied. "I recognized your cigarette. You threw it down when you ran into the hut. You saw me, no doubt, when you were looking for the prisoner." "I was careless to stand outside when the moon was out." "Yes, I saw you then," I told him. "Now your boy has been seen. That's how I found you." Holmes picked up the scribbled note. "So you have visited Mrs. Laura Lyons?" he asked. "Exactly," I said. "Well done," Holmes said. "We are both on the same track. When we put our results together, we shall have a fuller knowledge of the case." "Well, I'm glad that you are here," I said, "for the mystery of this case was becoming too much for me." "But what have you been doing, Holmes? Don't you trust me? I think I deserve better." "My dear Watson," Holmes said, "please forgive me if I seem to have tricked you. But if I had come with you and Sir Henry, our enemies would have been on guard. As it is, I have been able to make enquiries in secret." "But why keep me in the dark?" I asked angrily. "You would have tried to see me," Holmes replied. "It would have been a risk." "My reports have all been wasted," I cried, my voice trembling. Holmes took a bundle of papers from his pocket. "Here are your reports, my dear fellow," he said, "and very good they are, too. I must congratulate you on the intelligence you have shown in this most difficult case." Holmes's praise drove the anger from my mind. "You are right," I muttered. "That's better," he said. "And now tell me the result of your visit to Mrs. Laura Lyons. If you had not gone today, I should have gone tomorrow." The sun had set and dusk was sitting over the moor. The air had turned cold and we went back into the hut for warmth. I told him what I had learned at Coombe Tracey. "This is most important," he said when I had finished. "It fills a gap. You are aware that there is also a close friendship between Mrs. Lyons and Jack Stapleton. Now, if I could use it to persuade Mr. Stapleton's wife—" "His wife?" I asked in surprise. "I am giving you some information now, in return for all you have just given me," Holmes said. "The lady you think of as his sister is really his wife." "Are you sure, Holmes?" I cried. "Then how could he let Sir Henry fall in love with her?" "That does no harm to anybody, except Sir Henry," Holmes said. "Stapleton thought his wife would be more useful if everybody thought she was a free woman." "It is Stapleton, then, who is our enemy. It is he who followed us in London after Sir Henry's arrival?" I asked. "So I read the riddle," Holmes said. "And the warning, the note to Sir Henry, it must have come from his wife?" I asked. "Exactly," Holmes replied. "But if this woman is his wife," I said, "where does Mrs. Laura Lyons fit into the plan?" "She expected to become his wife," Holmes said. "And when she learns that Stapleton is already married?" I asked. "Then we may find the lady will want to help us," Holmes said. "Now, Watson, don't you think you have been away from Sir Henry too long? Your place should be at Baskerville Hall." He stared straight into my eyes. "Remember," he said, "Sir Henry is in great danger." Chapter 8. Murder on the Moor. The last rays of the sun had faded away. It was night now, and a few stars twinkled in a dark purple sky. I got up. "One last question, Holmes," I said. "What is Stapleton after?" Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "I only know that it is murder, Watson," he said. "Cold-blooded murder. Do not ask me the reason, not yet. But my net is closing in on Stapleton, as he is closing in on Sir Henry. There is only one danger. He could strike before we are ready. I need another day or two. Until then, guard Sir Henry. I wish you had not left him for so long. Holmes suddenly stopped speaking. "What's that?" he asked. A terrible scream filled the air, a long scream of terror and horror. The terrible cry turned my blood cold. "Oh, my God!" I gasped. "What is it? What does it mean?" Holmes jumped to his feet and went to the door of the hut. "Shh!" he whispered. "Shh!" Now the cry was nearer, louder, and more urgent than before. "Where is it?" Holmes whispered. I knew from his voice that he was very shaken. "Where is it, Watson?" he asked again. "There, I think," I said, pointing into the darkness. The terrible cry swept through the silent night again, louder and nearer than ever. "The hound!" Holmes cried. "Come, Watson, come! Let us hope we are not too late." Holmes started to run across the moor, and I followed him. From the ground immediately in front of us came one last cry of despair, then a heavy thud. We stopped and listened. No sound broke the heavy silence of the still night. I saw Holmes put his hand to his forehead, then he stamped his foot on the ground. "What if Stapleton has beaten us, Watson?" he said. "What if we are too late?" "No, no, surely not!" I cried. "I was a fool to wait!" Holmes cried. We ran on through the darkness, forcing our way through bushes, stumbling on rocks toward the direction of those terrible cries. At every hill, Holmes looked around hopefully, but the shadows were thick on the moor, and nothing moved. "Listen! What's that?" I asked. We heard a low moan. There it was again on our left! On that side was a ridge of rocks which ended in a steep cliff. On the slope below we could just make out a dark shape. As we ran toward it, we could make out the shape of a man. He was lying face down on the ground, his body hunched up. Not a whisper, not a sound came from his lips now. Holmes bent down over the man and struck a match. In the light we saw the crushed skull, a growing pool of blood seeping from it. And it shone upon something else, something which made us feel sick and faint. The body of Sir Henry Baskerville. Chapter 9. A strong enemy. There could be no mistake. In the flickering light of the match, we caught a glimpse of the same tweed suit that Sir Henry had worn when he had first visited us in Baker Street. Suddenly the match went out, and with it all hope that we might have been wrong. "The brute! The brute!" I cried. "Oh, Holmes, I shall never forgive myself for leaving him." "I am more to blame than you, Watson," Holmes said. "This is the biggest blow of my career." "We heard his screams and could not save him," I cried. "But where is this hound which drove him to his death? And Stapleton, where is he?" "Now we have to prove the link between Stapleton and the hound," Holmes said. "We do not even know if the hound really exists. But Sir Henry obviously died trying to escape from it, just as Sir Charles did." We stood by that mangled body until the moon rose. Then we climbed to the top of the rocks over which our poor friend had fallen. We gazed over the shadowy moor at the yellow light of Stapleton's house far in the distance. "Let's seize him now," I cried. "No," Holmes said. "Now we must send for help to take back our dear friend." Holmes looked at the body one last time. "A beard! A beard! This man has a beard!" he shouted. "He is not Sir Henry." We turned the man over. There was no doubt. Lying in front of us was Mrs. Barrymore's brother, the escaped prisoner. "Sir Henry gave some of his clothes to Barrymore," I said. "He must have passed them on to his brother-in-law." "The hound thought it was Sir Henry," Holmes said. "It must have been given something of Sir Henry's to sniff to pick up the scent. Of course, the boot that went missing from Sir Henry's hotel in London. Do you remember?" I nodded. As we talked, we saw a man approaching us across the moor. "It's Stapleton," Holmes whispered. "Not a word about our suspicions, or my plan won't work." Jack Stapleton stopped in surprise when he saw us. "Why, Dr. Watson," he said, "you are the last person I expected to see on the moor at this time of night." He looked at the ground. "Is somebody hurt?" he asked. Don't tell me that it's our friend Sir Henry." Stapleton hurried past me and stooped over the body. I heard him take a deep breath, and his cigar fell from his fingers. Then he looked up at us with a ghastly pale face as he tried to hide his surprise and disappointment. Who's this?" he stammered. "An escaped prisoner," I explained. How did he die?" Stapleton asked. "He appears to have fallen over these rocks and broken his neck," Holmes told him. "What brings you here, sir?" "I heard a cry," Stapleton said at last. "I was afraid something had happened to Sir Henry. I asked him to dine with me tonight, and he has not arrived." He smiled at Holmes. "We have been expecting you, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said. Holmes bowed. "I return to London tomorrow," he said coldly. We left Stapleton there and set off to Baskerville Hall. "What a nerve the man has!" Holmes exclaimed. "He is a strong enemy indeed. We are close to unmasking him, but—" "Why can't we arrest him now?" I cried angrily. "So far we cannot prove anything," Holmes said. "We should be laughed out of court. I hope Mrs. Laura Lyons may help us. Now, say nothing to Sir Henry about tonight, Watson." I looked at Holmes in surprise. He paused. "Then he will be stronger for the terrible ordeal he will face tomorrow night." Chapter 10. The Hound of the Baskervilles. Sir Henry was pleased to see Sherlock Holmes, and we talked for a long time of the strange events of the past few weeks. As we were eating dinner, I noticed that Holmes kept staring over my head at the wall behind me. "Those are fine portraits, Sir Henry," he said at last. "Tell me, who is the man wearing black velvet and lace?" "Ah, he is the cause of all the trouble," Sir Henry said. "That is the wicked Hugo Baskerville, who started the legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles." Holmes stared at the portrait all evening. Later, when Sir Henry had gone to bed, he took me back to the dining room and held a candle up to Hugo Baskerville's portrait. "Is it like anyone you know?" he asked. "There is something of Sir Henry about the jaw," I told him. Holmes jumped onto a chair and put his arm over Hugo's hat and ringlets to hide them. "Good heavens!" I cried in amazement. "He could be Stapleton!" "Stapleton is a Baskerville. I am sure of it," Holmes said. "This is our missing link, Watson. He is after his inheritance." Holmes laughed. "We have him, Watson, we have him. I swear that before tomorrow night he will be fluttering in our net as helpless as one of his butterflies." Early the next morning, Holmes told Sir Henry that he and I were leaving for London. Our friend looked deeply hurt. "You must do as I tell you, Sir Henry," Holmes said. "You will go in your carriage to Stapleton's tonight, then send the driver back. Tell the Stapletons that you intend to walk home." "Walk across the moor?" Sir Henry asked, horrified. "You told me never to do that." "You must do it tonight," Holmes said. "You will be safe. Take your usual path." "Then I will do it," Sir Henry replied. At the railway station, we met the boy who had looked after Holmes so well on the moor. He caught the London train, with instructions to send a telegram as soon as he arrived, from Sherlock Holmes. We went immediately to see Mrs. Laura Lyons. When Holmes told her the truth about Stapleton's wife, she turned deadly pale. "But he promised to marry me," she whispered. "Yes, I will help you, sir," she said at last. "The letter to Sir Charles? That was Stapleton's idea?" Holmes asked. "Yes," Mrs. Lyons whispered. "Then he frightened me into not telling anybody." "Thank you, Mrs. Lyons," Holmes said. "That is all I need you to tell me." We went straight up onto the moors when we left Mrs. Lyons, walking slowly through a thick fog, which rolled in from Grimpen Mire. As we came close to Merripit House, I peeped through the dining-room window and saw Jack Stapleton talking to Sir Henry. After a few minutes, he left the house and walked to a building in the grounds. He unlocked the door, went in for a minute, then came out, locking the door again. I went back to the others. A thick white fog drifted toward us, like a shimmering ice field. But above us the sky was clear. "Sir Henry must come out before the fog reaches us," Holmes whispered. The fog curled over the roof of Merripit House toward us. We moved back a little, and the fog came after us. Suddenly the sound of footsteps broke the silence of the moor. Sir Henry came through the curtain of fog into the clear, starlit night. Then I sprang to my feet, trying not to scream. A dreadful shape had sprung from the shadow of the fog. It was a hound, but nothing like anything I had ever seen before. Fire burst from its open mouth. Its eyes glowed and flames flickered along its nose. I had never seen anything so hellish and so savage. That huge black creature leaped along the path after our dear friend. We hesitated, Holmes and I. Then we fired our pistols at it. The creature gave a terrible howl, but it did not stop. We saw Sir Henry look behind him, his face white in the moonlight. He raised his hands in horror. "If we can wound the hound, we can kill it!" Holmes shouted as he ran after the creature. Sir Henry screamed. The hound roared, then leaped upon his victim. At that moment, Holmes fired 5 times. With a last roll of agony, the animal rolled onto its back, then lay still. The giant hound was dead. "My God!" Sir Henry whispered. "What was it?" "It's dead, whatever it was," Holmes said. "We've laid the family ghost forever." We looked at the dead creature in front of us. It was as large as a lioness. Even now its jaws seemed to drip with a bluish flame. Its small, deep-set, cruel eyes had a ring of fire around them. I put my hand on the hound's glowing nose, then took my hand away. Now my hand gleamed in the darkness. "Phosphorus!" I said. Sir Henry staggered to his feet, pale and trembling. He went and sat on a rock, shivering. "We must leave you now," Holmes told him. "We still have to catch our man. We shall look first in Merripit House." But we found only one person there, Jack Stapleton's wife, tied and gagged and bruised. "There is only one place he could have gone," she told us, when she could speak at last. "There is an old tin mine on an island in the middle of Grimpen Mire. He kept his hound there. But nobody could find his way there in this fog, except him." "We shall wait until morning," Holmes said. We went back to Sir Henry and took him to Baskerville Hall. The news of Stapleton's crimes was a great blow to him, and he fell ill with a fever. Holmes and I went into Grimpen Mire the next morning. There we found Sir Henry's missing boot and a tin of phosphorus. But we never found Jack Stapleton's body. The Wizard of Oz 1. Lyman Frank Baum. Chapter 1. The Tornado. A young girl named Dorothy went to live with her aunt and uncle because she was an orphan. They lived on a farm right in the middle of the Kansas prairie. There were no trees or other houses, just the baking hot sun, the whistling wind, and the tornadoes, which often blew across this part of the country. One day, the sky was grayer than usual. From the north came the wail of the wind. The corn swayed. Then the air from the south whistled. "There's a tornado comin', Em," Uncle Henry shouted to his wife. "I'm going to check on the cattle. You take Dorothy down to the cellar." Aunt Em was so frightened that she ran to the cellar, leaving Dorothy to follow her. As Dorothy went to pick up Toto, a little black dog, the wind shook the house hard. Then a strange thing happened. The house whirled around and around and rose slowly into the air. "I'll stay here and see what happens," Dorothy told herself as she sat down on the floor. Hour after hour, the house moved and swayed gently until Dorothy fell asleep. Suddenly, the house gave a big jolt, and Toto began to whine. Dorothy woke up. She ran to open the door, and bright sunshine flooded the little house. "Look, Toto!" Dorothy cried. "It's beautiful out there. There are fruit trees and flowers and birds." As she watched, strange people gathered around the house. They were small, as big as Dorothy, but older than her, and they wore pointed hats with belts around the brim. The men wore blue, and the women wore white. An old woman came up to the door of the house. "Welcome to the land of Munchkins," she said. "Thank you for killing the witch. You have set them all free." Dorothy was surprised. "But I haven't killed anybody," she cried. The old woman pointed to the corner of the house. "Those are the witch's feet," she said. "Your house fell on her." "Oh, dear," Dorothy said, her heart beating faster. "Who was she? And who are you?" "She was the Wicked Witch of the East," the old woman replied. "And I am the Witch of the North. I came here as fast as I could when I heard that she was dead." "We do not have witches in Kansas," Dorothy said. "The land of Oz has 4 witches," the woman said. "2 of them, who live in the north and the south, are good. The other 2, who live here in the east and in the west, are bad. I am not as powerful as the Wicked Witch of the East, or I should have freed the Munchkins myself." "The land of Oz?" Dorothy asked in surprise. "Is that where I am?" "Yes," she said. It is ruled by a great wizard called Oz. He is more powerful than the rest of us." "Where is he?" Dorothy asked. "He lives in the City of Emeralds," the old woman said. Suddenly she began to laugh. "Look! The witch has melted away!" she cried. "Only her shoes are left. They are yours now. They have a magic charm, but I cannot remember what it is." Dorothy picked up the shoes and put them on the table. "I want to go back to my aunt and uncle now," she said. "Can you help me to find the way home?" The Munchkins shook their heads. "There is a terrible desert to the east," one said. "There is a terrible desert to the south where the Quadlings live," said another. "And a terrible desert to the west," said a third. "There the Wicked Witch of the West rules the yellow people called the Winkies. They are her slaves." "The north is my home," the old lady said, "and it too is surrounded by desert. I'm afraid you will have to stay in the land of Oz." Dorothy began to cry, so the Good Witch took off her cap and balanced the point on the end of her nose. "1, 2, 3," she said. The cap changed to a piece of slate. On it was written, "Let Dorothy go to the City of Emeralds." "Is your name Dorothy, dear?" the old woman asked. "Yes," she said. "Where is the city?" "It is in the center of the land of Oz," she replied. "Is the great wizard a good man?" Dorothy asked. "I do not know if he is a man or a woman because I have never seen him," the old woman explained. "But he is a good wizard. It is a long journey to reach him, and it will be dangerous." "Please come with me," Dorothy begged. The old woman shook her head. "I cannot," she said. She kissed Dorothy's forehead. "But nobody will harm a person who has been kissed by the Witch of the North. Now, look for a road made with yellow bricks, and when you get to the City of Emeralds, tell Oz what has happened. Goodbye, my dear." The Good Witch of the North whirled around 3 times and vanished. "Come on, Toto," Dorothy said. "We must get ready for our journey." They ate and drank. Dorothy filled a basket with bread from the cupboard. She put on her blue and white checked dress and a sun hat, took off her old shoes and put on the silver shoes, and she locked the door of the house and put the key in her pocket. Then Dorothy and Toto set off bravely to find the yellow brick road, the one that would take them all the way to the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Chapter 2. The Yellow Brick Road. It was easy to find the right road. It was the only one paved with yellow bricks. How pretty the countryside was! The sun shone as Dorothy and Toto walked along, and the birds sang. The Munchkins lived in round houses with domed roofs. They had heard that Dorothy had killed the Wicked Witch of the East, and they came out to see her as she walked past. That evening, as it grew dark, a Munchkin named Bock invited her to eat and spend the night with his family. "You must be a great witch," he said. "You wear silver shoes. You have killed the witch, and you have white in your dress, and only good witches wear white. And it is kind of you to wear blue, too, because blue is the Munchkins' favorite color." "I am only an ordinary girl, blown here by a tornado," Dorothy thought, "but they think I am a witch." The next morning she got ready to set off with Toto again. "How far is it to the City of Emeralds?" she asked Bock. "I do not know," he replied. "I have never been there, but I know that it is a long way, and that you must pass through many dangerous places to get there." "I cannot turn back now," Dorothy thought. I need Oz's help to get to Kansas. She said goodbye to the Munchkins and set off once more down the yellow brick road. After walking a few miles, she decided to rest in a cornfield. Dorothy sat gazing at a scarecrow stuffed with straw and wearing blue Munchkin clothes. Suddenly, one of its eyes winked at her. Then it said, "Hello, how are you?" "Did you speak?" Dorothy asked. "Yes," the Scarecrow replied. "How are you?" "Very well, thank you," Dorothy said. "And how are you?" "I'm not feeling well," the Scarecrow replied. "Perched up on this pole all day and all night." "Can't you get down?" Dorothy asked. "Not unless you take this pole away," he replied. Dorothy reached up and lifted the Scarecrow to the ground. He bowed and walked around her. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Dorothy," she replied, "and I come from Kansas. I am going to ask the Wizard of Oz to help me go home." "Who is Oz?" the straw man asked. "You see, my head is stuffed with straw, and I have no brains. None at all. Do you think the Wizard of Oz could give me some?" "I don't know," Dorothy said, "but you are welcome to come with me." They set off along the yellow brick road. As they walked, Dorothy told the straw man all about the gray prairies of Kansas. "I cannot understand why you want to leave this beautiful country to go back to such a dreary place," he said. "That is because you have no brains," Dorothy teased him. "There is no place like home." The road became rough and full of holes. Toto jumped over them. Dorothy walked around them, but the straw man fell into them. There were fewer houses, and the countryside was bleak and lonely, and there were no crops in the fields. It began to grow dark. At last, they found a deserted cottage, where they spent the night. The next morning, as they set out on the road again, they heard a terrible groan. Dorothy crept forward, afraid. "I can see the sun shining on something bright in the trees," she whispered. She stopped suddenly and gasped in surprise. A man made of tin was standing by a tree with an axe in his hand. Toto barked and snapped at the man's legs, but he did not move. "Did you groan?" Dorothy asked politely. "Yes," the Tin Man replied. "I have been standing here groaning for more than a year, and nobody has to help me." "How can I help you?" Dorothy asked. The Tin Man told Dorothy to go to his little cottage and bring back his oil can. As soon as Dorothy had oiled his joints, he put down his axe and moved freely again. "Thank you," he said. "You have saved my life. I left my oil can behind and was caught in a storm which rusted me. But why are you here?" When Dorothy had told him her story, the Tin Man said, "I once had brains and a heart, but now I have no heart. Do you think Oz could give me one?" "I don't know," Dorothy said, "but you are welcome to come with us." And soon Dorothy, Toto, the Straw Man, and the Tin Man were walking along the yellow brick road, and ready for any danger that might come their way. Chapter 3. A Cowardly Lion. "Why don't you have a heart?" the straw man asked as they walked along. "I became a woodman like my father," the Tin Man explained, "and I planned to marry a Munchkin girl who lived with an old woman nearby. This old woman did not want to lose the girl, so she asked the Wicked Witch of the East to stop the marriage." "How did she do that?" Dorothy asked. "She put a spell on my axe, he replied. "One day when I was chopping wood, it fell and chopped off my leg. So the tinsmith made me a tin leg. The axe cut off my other leg, my arms, my head, and split my body in two. The tinsmith replaced each part, and I thought I had beaten the witch. But I had no heart, and I could no longer love my Munchkin girl." "I should prefer to have brains," the straw man said, "for a fool would not know what to do with a heart." "Brains do not make a person happy," the Tin Man said, "and happiness is the best thing in the world." "Which of them is right?" Dorothy asked herself. "I wish I could get back to Kansas to ask Aunt Em." Now Dorothy and her friends were walking through thick, dark woods. Sometimes they heard a deep growl, and Toto kept close to Dorothy's side. He did not even bark. "The Good Witch's kiss will keep me from harm," Dorothy thought, "and nothing can hurt the Tin Man and the Straw Man. But I am afraid for Toto." From behind the trees came a terrible roar. Suddenly an enormous lion leapt out in front of them. He pushed the straw man off the road and clawed at the Tin Man, knocking him over. Little Toto ran barking toward him. Dorothy, afraid that the lion would hurt him, slapped the lion hard on his nose. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she cried, "attacking a man made of straw and a man made of tin, and this little animal. You're a coward."
"I know," the lion said sadly. "What is that little animal?"
"He's my dog," she said. "Why are you such a coward when you're so big?"
"I think I was born that way," the lion replied. "All the other animals expect me to be brave because I am the king of the beasts. I have learned to roar loudly, and that frightens everybody. But my heart beats fast whenever there is any danger."
"At least you have a heart," the Tin Man said. "I'm going to ask the Wizard of Oz to give me one." "I'm going to ask him to give me brains," the straw man said. "I'm going to ask him how I can get home," Dorothy said.
"Do you think he could give me courage?" the lion asked. "As long as I know that I'm a coward, I shall be unhappy."
"I do not know," Dorothy replied, "but you are welcome to come with us. You will help to scare away the other wild animals." And once more, the little band of friends set off down the yellow brick road. They slept under the trees that night and ate nuts and bread. But when they had been walking less than an hour the next morning, they came to a big ditch across the road. It was wide and deep, with steep sides. "What can we do?" Dorothy cried.
"We must stay here," the straw man replied.
To their surprise, the lion looked at the ditch and said,
"I think I could jump over it. I could carry you all on my back. Who wants to be first?"
"Me," the straw man said, "because a fall can't hurt me." Soon they were all safely on the other side of the ditch, where they found themselves in a very dark and gloomy part of the forest.
"This is where the Kalidas live," the lion whispered. "They are great beasts with bodies like bears and heads like tigers. Their claws are so long and sharp that they could tear me in two. I'm afraid of them."
As the lion spoke, they came to another ditch across the road. It was so wide that even the lion could not jump it. "There is a big tree over there," the straw man said. "The Tin Man could cut it down to make a bridge for us."
"That's a good idea," the lion said. "You must have some brains in your head."
The Tin Man set to work. When he had almost finished chopping, the lion pushed the great trunk across the ditch. As they began to cross, the Kalidas started running toward them. The lion, who was last in the line, gave a roar so terrible that the beasts stopped. But only for a moment. Then they began to move forward again.
"They will tear us to pieces now," the lion said to Dorothy. "Stand behind me. I shall fight back as long as I am alive."
Chapter 4. Deadly Poppies.
"Quickly," the straw man called to the Tin Man. "Chop away the log at this end."
The Tin Man raised his axe at once. Just as the Kalidas had almost reached them, the tree trunk fell onto the rocks below, taking the two terrible beasts with it.
"My heart is beating fast," the lion said. "I wish I had a heart," the straw man replied.
They walked as quickly as they could through the rest of the forest and came to a river. On the other side, they could see the yellow brick road running through beautiful countryside full of flowers and fruit trees.
"The Tin Man must build us a raft,"
the straw man said. As the Tin Man used his axe, the others picked and ate the delicious fruit. It takes a long time to build a raft, and they had to sleep under the trees when darkness fell. The next morning the travelers were full of hope. The sun was shining, they had eaten well, and the raft was finished. Dorothy sat in the middle of the raft, holding Toto. The straw man and the Tin Man stood together on the far side, with the heavy lion on the other. Then they pushed from the bank with long poles. But in the middle of the river, their poles could not reach the bottom of the water, and the strong current began to carry them away. The straw man pushed so hard that his pole stuck in some mud, and he was left clinging to it.
"Once I was stuck on a pole in a cornfield," he thought, "but it is worse to be stuck on a pole in a river."
The Tin Man began to cry, until he remembered that he might make himself rusty.
"I think I can swim to the bank on the other side," the lion said. "I can pull the raft after me if you hold the tip of my tail."
He sprang into the water. It was hard work, but slowly the lion pulled them toward the bank. "How can we save the straw man?" Dorothy asked. The lion and the Tin Man shook their heads. They were still sitting on the bank, thinking, when a stork flew past.
"Where are you going?"
he asked them. "To the Emerald City," Dorothy replied. "But we are wondering how to save our friend over there." The stork looked.
"I could bring him back myself if he wasn't so big and heavy," she said.
"He isn't," Dorothy said. "He's very light because he's made of straw." The stork flew over the river and picked up the straw man in her great claws and carried him back to the bank. They started along the yellow brick road again, listening to the birds singing, looking at the beautiful flowers. A clump of scarlet poppies caught Dorothy's eye, and she leaned over to breathe in their perfume. Soon they found themselves in a great field of poppies. Their scent was so strong that Dorothy's eyes began to close.
"If we leave her here, she will die," the lion said. "The smell of these poppies is killing us all. Look, Toto is asleep now, and my eyes are close in."
"Run, lion!" the straw man shouted.
"The poppies cannot harm me or the Tin Man. We will carry Dorothy from this field, but you're too heavy to be carried."
The lion ran as fast as he could. The others carried Dorothy and Toto from the field, following the bend of the river. But at the edge of the field, they came across the lion, fast asleep.
"We must leave him here,"
the Tin Man said sadly.
"I'm sorry," the Straw Man said. "He was a good friend."
Chapter 5 The Emerald City. As the Straw Man and the Tin Man waited for Dorothy to wake up, they heard a loud growl. A strange beast was rushing across the grass toward them. It was a great yellow wildcat. Its mouth was wide open, showing 2 rows of ugly teeth, and its eyes glowed like balls of fire. He was chasing a tiny gray field mouse. The Tin Man raised his axe and cut off the wildcat's head. "Thank you for saving my life," the mouse squeaked.
"I help all those who need a friend, even if it is only a little mouse," the Tin Man replied.
"Only a mouse?" the animal cried. "I am a queen, the queen of all field mice." Several mice came running after their queen. "This funny Tin Man has saved my life," she said, "and from now on we must obey his every wish." Toto woke up and jumped at the mice, barking, but the Tin Man caught him in his arms. "Can we do anything to help?" one of the mice asked.
"Oh, yes. You can save our friend the lion who is asleep in the poppy field," the Tin Man replied.
"Send for all your mice and tell each mouse to bring a piece of string," the Straw Man said. When Dorothy opened her eyes, she saw thousands of mice scampering toward the lion. And that is how they saved the king of the beasts, by dragging him from the field of poppies. The lion woke up and laughed to think that such tiny creatures had saved him. Before they left, the queen of the mice handed Dorothy a small silver whistle. "If ever you need us again, call us. We shall come to help you. Goodbye." The friends set off again. The yellow brick road was smooth now. The fences and the houses were painted green, and the people wore green clothes and pointed hats. "We must be close to the Emerald City," Dorothy said. When they came to a farmhouse, Dorothy asked if they could spend the night there.
"What about the lion?" the woman asked.
"He's tame, and he's a coward," Dorothy said. They all went inside. The woman's family were surprised to see such a strange group of people. "We are going to see the Great Oz," Dorothy explained.
"Are you sure that Oz will see you?" her husband asked.
Dorothy was surprised to learn that nobody in the Emerald City had ever seen the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
"He never goes out,"
the farmer explained, "and nobody has ever seen him, not even his servants. He can take on any shape he wishes, a bird, a cat, an elephant,
but nobody knows who the real Oz is."
"Oh, dear," Dorothy said. "We must try to see him. Otherwise we shall have made our long journey for nothing."
"Why do you want to see him?"
he asked.
"I want a heart," the Tin Man said.
"I want some brains," the Straw Man said.
"I want some courage,"
the Lion said. "And I want to go home," Dorothy finished.
"Well, Oz can do anything," the farmer said, "but the most difficult thing is to get to see him first."
The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, they thanked the farmer and walked toward the green glow in the sky. "That must be the Emerald City," Dorothy said. By the afternoon, they had come to the great green wall around the city. In front of them, right at the end of the yellow brick road, was a big gate, studded with glittering emeralds. Dorothy pushed the bell and it swung open. They walked into an arched room where the walls glistened with emeralds. A man stood before them, dressed in green from head to toe. Even his skin was greenish, and next to him was a large green box. "Why have you come to the Emerald City?" he asked. "We came here to see the Great Oz," Dorothy replied. The man was so surprised that he sat down. "I am the guardian of the gate," he said, "and it has been many years since anybody asked to see Oz." He shook his head. "He is powerful and terrible." He looked straight at them. "If you have come here for no good reason, he will be angry, and he will destroy all of you in the blinking of an eye." The Wizard of Oz 2. Lyman Frank Baum. Chapter 6. The Wonderful World of Oz. "We have come here for a good reason," the straw man said. "We have been told that Oz is a good wizard." "Yes, he is," the guardian of the gate said, "and he rules the Emerald City wisely. But nobody has ever dared to ask to see him. Ah, well, since you have asked to see the Great Oz, I must take you to his palace. But first, put on these spectacles. The brightness of the Emerald City will blind you." He opened the big box, gave them each a pair of spectacles, which he locked around their heads with a key. Then he put on his own spectacles and led them into the streets of the Emerald City. The green marble houses dazzled them, and all the people were dressed in green. They came to a big building in the middle of the city. "This is the palace of the Wizard of Oz," the guardian said. He turned to the green-bearded soldier guarding the door. "These strangers are asking to see Oz." The soldier took a message to the throne room, to Oz himself. At last he came back. "Have you seen Oz?" Dorothy asked.
"Oh, no," the soldier replied. "But I spoke to him. He wanted to send you away, until I told him that you had a mark on your forehead and you were wearing silver shoes. He will see you in the morning."
He blew a green whistle and a young girl came in. She showed them to pretty rooms with fountains in the center and shelves with green books. In the wardrobe was a green dress which fit Dorothy perfectly. Dorothy was the first to visit the wonderful Wizard of Oz, dressed in green and carrying Toto. When a bell rang, she entered the throne room. It was a beautiful room. Emeralds glittered everywhere, lit by a great light as bright as the sun. In the middle of the room stood a throne, and on it was an enormous head. No arms, no legs, no body, no hair. But it had eyes, a nose, and an enormous mouth. As Dorothy gazed at it, afraid, the mouth opened.
"I am Oz, the great and terrible," it said. "Who are you, and why have you come here?"
"I am Dorothy, the small and the meek," she replied. "I have come for your help."
"Where did you get those silver shoes?"
Oz asked. "I got them from the Wicked Witch of the East," Dorothy explained. "My house killed her when it fell on her."
"Where did you get that mark on your forehead?"
"That is where the Good Witch of the North kissed me when she sent me to find you," Dorothy replied. "Please help me to go home to Kansas." Oz stared hard at Dorothy.
"In my country, you have to pay for what you get," he said. "If I use my magic powers to help you, you must help me in return."
"What must I do?" Dorothy asked.
"I want you to kill the Wicked Witch of the West,"
he replied.
"She is the only wicked witch left in the land of Oz. She has made the yellow Winkies her slaves."
Dorothy began to cry. "I have never killed anyone," she said. "And if you are a great wizard and cannot kill her, how would I do it?"
"I do not know," the head replied. "But go and do what I ask, and do not ask to see me again until you have done it."
Dorothy left the throne room and told her friends what Oz had said. Then she went to her room and cried herself to sleep. When the straw man went to see Oz, he found a beautiful lady sitting on the throne. The Tin Man found a roaring beast, and the lion found a ball of fire. Each shape gave the same command:
"Kill the Wicked Witch of the West."
"What shall we do?" Dorothy asked her friends sadly. "I do not want to kill anybody." "We have to do it," her friends replied. "We must go to the land of the Winkies and kill her." The Tin Man sharpened his axe for the journey and oiled his joints. The straw man stuffed himself with fresh straw. The green girl filled Dorothy's basket with good things to eat. The green-bearded soldier led them to the gates of the Emerald City. The guardian of the gate unlocked their spectacles and opened the door for them. "Which road leads to the Wicked Witch of the West?" Dorothy asked him.
"There is no road," he replied. "Nobody ever wants to go that way."
Chapter 7. The Wicked Witch of the West. "But how will we find the Wicked Witch?" Dorothy asked.
"She will find you as soon as you enter the country of the Winkies," the guardian explained. "She will make you her slaves, like them."
"No, she won't," the straw man replied. "We are going to kill her."
"Be careful," the man replied. "She is wicked and fierce. She will never allow you to kill her. Now keep to the west, where the sun sets."
They turned toward the west, walking across fields full of daisies and buttercups. To her surprise, Dorothy saw that her dress was now white, and so was Toto's ribbon. The ground became hilly. There were no crops and no farmhouses. It was hot, too, for there were no trees to give them shade. The Wicked Witch of the West had only one eye, but it was as powerful as a telescope. It could see everywhere and everything. As she sat at the door of her castle, she saw Dorothy and Toto and the lion lying asleep on the ground while the others kept watch. She blew her silver whistle angrily, and a pack of wolves came running up to her.
"Run and tear those people over there to pieces," she commanded. "They are no use to me. One is a girl, another a lion, and the others are made of straw and of tin."
When the straw man and the Tin Man saw the wolves coming, the Tin Man seized his axe.
"Get behind me," he said to the straw man. "This is my fight."
And he killed them all, 40 wolves, and they set off on their journey again. The Wicked Witch of the West was angrier. She blew her silver whistle twice, and a flock of wild crows came towards her.
"Fly and peck those people to pieces," she commanded.
When he saw the crows flying toward them, the straw man said,
"Lie down beside me. This is my fight."
And he killed them all, 40 of them, and they set off on their journey again. The Wicked Witch of the West blew her silver whistle 3 times, and a swarm of black bees flew toward her.
"Fly to those people and sting them to death," she commanded.
When the straw man saw the bees flying toward them, he said to the Tin Man,
"Take out my straw and spread it over everybody."
The bees flew at the Tin Man, but they could not sting him. Then the bees died because bees die when they lose their sting. As soon as the others had stuffed the straw back into the straw man, they all started on their journey again. The Wicked Witch of the West was so angry that she stamped her feet and called 12 Winky slaves to her. She gave them each a spear.
"Go and kill those strangers,"
she commanded. But the Winkies were not brave. They crept closer and closer to Dorothy until the lion roared. Then they ran back to the castle where the witch beat them with a strap.
"I shall have to use my golden cap now,"
she said to herself. This golden cap had magic powers. Its owners could call up the winged monkeys for help, but only 3 times.
"I have already called them twice before," the witch thought. "This is my last chance, but I have no choice. Everything else has failed."
The Wicked Witch took the golden cap from her cupboard and placed it on her head. Then she stood on her left foot and said,
"Epi, pay, pay, cock-kay."
Then she stood on her right foot and said,
"Hillo, holo, hello."
Then on both feet she cried,
"Zizzai, zuzai, zeek."
Now the charm began to work. The sky darkened, and a low rumbling filled the air. There was a rush of wings, a chattering and laughing. When the sun came out again, it lit up a crowd of monkeys with huge wings on their shoulders surrounding the Wicked Witch. "Why have you called us?" their leader asked. "There are strangers in my land," she told him.
"Go and destroy them all except the lion. I have decided to put him to work in the fields like a horse."
"Your command shall be obeyed,"
he said. And he flew away with the others to Dorothy and her friends. Some of the monkeys seized the Tin Man and dropped him far away onto the rocks. Some caught hold of the straw man and pulled out all his straw. Some tied ropes around the lion and took him back to the witch's castle. But they did not harm Dorothy at all. The leader of the winged monkeys flew up to her, stretching out his long, hairy arms to take her. Then he saw the mark of the good witch on her forehead.
"This girl is protected by the power of good,"
he shouted to the others.
"And that is stronger than the power of evil. We will take her to the castle."
The Wicked Witch of the West knew that she could not harm Dorothy, although she put her to work in the kitchen. She looked at the mark on her forehead, looked down at her silver shoes, and trembled with fear.
"She does not understand how powerful her shoes are," she thought. "I must get them for myself."
But Dorothy never took off her shoes, except at night and when she took her bath. The witch was terrified of the dark, and even more terrified of water. So she tricked Dorothy. She made her fall onto the kitchen floor and snatched up one of the shoes when it fell off. Now she had half the power.
"Give me back my shoe!"
Dorothy shouted.
"I will not,"
the witch said. Dorothy was so angry that she picked up a bucket of water and threw it over the Wicked Witch. To her horror and surprise, the witch began to shrink. Then she melted into a brown, sticky mess with a silver shoe in the middle.
"The Wicked Witch of the West is dead!"
she shouted to the lion and to the Winky slaves.
"You are all free!"
But one thought spoiled her happiness that day. What had happened to the Straw Man and the Tin Man? Chapter 8. An Ordinary Man. Dorothy and the lion asked some of the Winkies to help them rescue their friends. They traveled for almost 2 days, until they came to the rocky plain where the Tin Man lay. He was battered and bent, and his axe was rusty. The Winkies carried him gently back to the castle. "Are any of your people tinsmiths?" Dorothy asked. They nodded and brought tools to mend him. For 3 days they hammered and bent and pounded. They fitted a new golden handle to his axe, and its polished blade shone like silver. At last, the Tin Man was as good as new. He walked to Dorothy's room and thanked her.
"If only we had the straw man with us again," he wept.
Dorothy wept too. "We must try to find him," she said. So she called the Winkies to help her. They walked for almost 2 days until they came to a tall tree. Up in its branches they saw the straw man's clothes. The Tin Man chopped down the tree and they carried the clothes back to the castle. They stuffed them with clean straw. At last, the straw man was as good as new. "We have killed the Wicked Witch of the West, just as the Wizard of Oz asked us," Dorothy said. "Now it is time to go back to the Emerald City and make him keep his promise."
"I shall get my heart," the Tin Man said.
"I shall get my brains," the straw man said.
"I shall get my courage,"
the lion said. "And I shall go back home," Dorothy said. They set off the next day. Dorothy filled her basket with food from the witch's cupboard for the journey. There she found the golden cap, and she decided to wear it instead of her old sunbonnet. It was hard to find their way back because the winged monkeys had flown them to the land of the Winkies. Day after day they walked through yellow daisies and buttercups, and still they did not see the poppy fields ahead. "We are lost," Dorothy thought. Then she remembered the silver whistle the Queen of the Mice had given her. She blew hard. In a few minutes the mice came pattering toward them. "Can you show us the way back?" Dorothy asked. The Queen looked at the golden cap on Dorothy's head. "Why don't you call the winged monkeys?" she asked. "They will fly you to the land of Oz in less than an hour. You only have to repeat the words written inside it." "I didn't know," Dorothy said in surprise. She repeated the charm and the winged monkeys appeared. In less than an hour, they were flying above the shining walls of the Emerald City. The monkeys put them down outside the gates, bowed, and flew off again. The guardian of the gate was surprised to see them, but he took the news of the Wicked Witch's death straight to the Wizard of Oz. He did not reply. They waited for 3 days. At last the straw man became impatient. "Tell Oz," he said, "that if he does not let us see him and keep his promise, we shall call the winged monkeys." The Wizard of Oz was so frightened by this message that he sent for them all the next day. But when they went into the throne room, there was nobody there. A loud voice called from the dome.
"I am Oz, the Great and the Terrible," it said. "Why have you come to see me?"
"We have come to claim our promise," Dorothy replied.
"Is the Wicked Witch of the West really dead?"
the voice asked. "Yes," Dorothy said.
"Come back tomorrow,"
it commanded them. "No!" they all cried. "You must keep your promise now." The lion decided to frighten the wizard with a loud roar. Toto jumped up and ran away, knocking over a wooden screen in the corner of the room. Behind it stood a little old man with a bald head and wrinkled face. "Who are you?" the Tin Man cried, raising his axe.
"I am Oz, the Great and Terrible,"
he replied in a trembling voice. Dorothy and her friends looked at him in dismay. "So you are not a great wizard?" Dorothy asked.
"No, I'm afraid not," he replied. "I'm just an ordinary man."
Chapter 9. Oz Flies Away. The Wizard of Oz led them to a small room behind the throne room.
"You will be the only people who will ever know what I really am," he said. "Look, you must know the truth."
In the corner of the room lay a great head with a painted face, the dress and mask of the lovely lady, and the beast was just skins sewn together. As for the ball of fire, it was a ball of cotton set alight with oil.
"I used to be a ventriloquist," Oz said, "so I can throw my voice wherever I wish." "You should be ashamed of yourself," the straw man said. "What are you doing in the land of Oz?" "I used to work for a circus in America," he replied. "I flew in a balloon at the entrance to attract people. One day I didn't come down again. I drifted until I came to this beautiful country. The people thought I was a great wizard. They did anything I asked, so I told them to build this city and this palace. I made them put on green spectacles so everything looked green. But I am afraid of the witches here. They have great power and I have none."
"So you asked me to kill one of them?" Dorothy said. "You are a very wicked man."
"Oh, no, I am a good man," he replied, "but a bad wizard."
"Can't you give me brains?" the straw man asked.
"You only learn by doing," Oz replied. "You have to know how to use your brains, and you have already done that. But come back tomorrow and I shall give you some." "Can you give me courage?" the lion asked. "You have plenty of courage," Oz replied. "Every living creature is afraid when it faces danger. Courage lies in facing danger when you are afraid, and you have already done that. But come back tomorrow and I shall give you some."
"Can you give me a heart?" the Tin Man asked.
"A heart makes most people unhappy," Oz replied. "You are lucky not to have one. But come back tomorrow and I shall give you one."
"Can you get me back home?" Dorothy asked.
"I shall need a few days to think about that," Oz said. "I shall do my best to help you all if you will keep my secret."
The next morning, Oz called in the straw man. He took the straw from his head and filled it with corn bran. "Bran new brains," he called it. And the straw man felt wiser. Oz called in the Tin Man. He cut a hole in his tin chest and placed a silk heart inside, and the Tin Man felt kinder. Oz called in the lion. He gave him a drink from a beautiful green bottle, and the lion felt braver.
"I have given them all what they thought they needed," Oz said to himself. "But it will be a little harder to carry Dorothy back to Kansas. I'm not sure how I can do that."
For 3 days, Dorothy heard nothing from Oz. Her friends were happy now, but she was still sad. On the 4th day, Oz sent for her.
"I came to this country by balloon," he said, "and you came in a tornado. So you must leave by air. I cannot make a tornado, but I can make a balloon. We shall have to use hot air to float it."
He looked at Dorothy.
"I don't like being shut in my palace all day," he said. "Can I come back with you?"
Dorothy nodded. They started to make the balloon straight away from strips of green silk, which they tied to a big clothes basket. News spread quickly inside the Emerald City, and everybody came to see the wonderful sight. The Tin Man lit a large fire, and the balloon swelled with hot air. Oz climbed into the basket.
I am going to visit my brother Wizard who lives in the clouds, he said to his people. The straw man will rule you while I'm away. Come on, Dorothy, get in.
But as Dorothy went to find Toto, the balloon began to tug at its ropes. Suddenly it rose into the air without her. "Come back!" she screamed. "I want to come with you!" And that was the last they saw of the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Dorothy wept bitterly. "How will I get home now?" she cried. Chapter 10. Home Again. The straw man tried to persuade Dorothy to stay in the Land of Oz. "No, I want to go home," Dorothy cried. "You could call the winged monkeys to take you," he replied. But the winged monkeys could not help because they could not go beyond their own land. "Let us ask the green-bearded soldier," the straw man said. "Glinda might be able to help you," the soldier said. "She is the Witch of the South. She rules over the Quadlings, and she is the most powerful witch of all. The road to her castle is straight to the south." "I think we should go there," the straw man said. "I can help too," the tin man said, "with my axe."
"Me too," the lion said. "I can protect her from the wild animals."
The sun shone brightly as the friends turned toward the land of the South. Dorothy was full of hope again. Soon they came to a forest. As the straw man was walking past a large tree, a branch picked him up and pushed him back. The same happened to the lion. But the tin man chopped off the branch and they all passed safely by. At last they came to a high white wall, which seemed to be made of china. The tin man made a ladder for them. They gasped in surprise as they reached the top. In front of them stretched countryside of smooth white china, like an enormous plate. There were houses and farms, people and animals, all made of china and all no higher than Dorothy's knee. They jumped from the wall and walked carefully through the country of China people. Everybody ran out of their way, afraid that the strangers would knock them over and break them. After about an hour, they reached another wall at the other end of the country. It was not so high and they jumped over easily, although the lion's tail smashed a china church. They walked through rough countryside full of bogs and marshes and tall grass, until they came to another forest.
"This is a beautiful forest," the lion said. "I'd like to live here."
As they reached an opening in the forest, they met hundreds of animals: tigers and elephants, bears and wolves and foxes. The others were afraid, but the lion said that they were just having a meeting. As they came close, the biggest of the tigers came up to them. "Welcome, King of the Beasts," he said to the lion. "You have come in time to bring peace again to all the animals of the forest. A terrible enemy threatens us, a monster spider who eats everything in sight. I'm glad you are here."
"If I kill it, can I be your king?" the lion asked.
"Yes," the tiger growled. "He's sleeping in that oak tree over there." The lion killed the creature as it slept. With one blow of his paw, he knocked its head off. Then he promised to return when Dorothy was safe on her way home. When they left the forest, they came to a steep rocky hill. They started to climb it until a harsh voice called out, "Go away! Nobody is allowed to climb our hill." A man stepped out from the rock, the strangest man they had ever seen. He had a big head held up by a wrinkled neck and no arms. As they carried on climbing, his neck stretched out to strike the straw man and send him tumbling down the hill. Hundreds of other hammerheads stood up behind the rocks, laughing. "Call the winged monkeys," the Tin Man told Dorothy. Dorothy used the golden cap for the third and last time. The winged monkeys carried them safely to the country of the Quadlings. It seemed a rich and happy place. Corn ripened in the fields. The houses and fences were painted red, and the people were all dressed in red. As they came close to the castle of Glinda, a young girl took Dorothy to a room where she washed her hands and face and combed her hair. The lion shook the dust from his mane, the straw man patted himself into his best shape, and the Tin Man polished himself and oiled his joints. The Witch of the South was sitting on a throne of rubies. She was beautiful and young, and her hair was red. Dorothy told her the story, how the tornado had brought her to the land of Oz, how she had met her friends, what adventures they had had. "But my greatest wish is to go back to Kansas," she said. "My Aunt Em will think that something terrible has happened to me." The witch Glinda kissed her. "I can tell you how to reach home," she said, "if you will give me the golden cap." "Yes," Dorothy said. "It is of no use to me now." "What will you do?" Glinda asked the straw man.
"I wish to return as ruler of the Emerald City," he said. "I like it, and the people like me. But how shall I get past the hammerheads on the hill?"
"I shall ask the winged monkeys to take you there," she replied. Glinda turned to the Tin Man. "What will become of you?"
"The Winkies were very kind to me," he replied. "If I could get back to the country of the West, I should like to rule them."
"I shall ask the winged monkeys to take you there," she replied. Glinda looked at the lion. "What about you?"
"I shall go back to the forest and become king of the beasts," he replied.
"Then my third wish of the golden cap shall be that," Glinda said. "The winged monkeys will take you there." "But how shall I get back to Kansas?" Dorothy asked. "Your silver shoes will carry you over the desert," Glinda replied. "If you had known how powerful they were, you could have returned the very first day."
"But I'd still be in a cornfield without my brains," the straw man said. "I'd have rusted in a forest and never had my heart," the Tin Man cried. "I should have lived a coward forever," the lion said. Dorothy was happy to see her friends so happy, but now all she wanted was to go home. She kissed her friends, said goodbye to the witch Glinda, and picked up Toto. Then she clapped the heels of her shoes together 3 times, as Glinda told her, and shouted, "Take me home to Aunt Em." The silver shoes took 3 steps. Suddenly Dorothy was swirling through the air. Then she stopped and found herself rolling over in the grass, barefoot as the wind had blown off the silver shoes. She was sitting next to the new farmhouse Uncle Henry had built after the tornado, and Aunt Em was running toward her shouting, "Where in the world have you come from, dear child?" "From the land of Oz," Dorothy replied. "And oh, Aunt Em, I'm so glad to be home again."
The Count of Monte Cristo 1. Alexander Dumas. Chapter 1. The Plot. Following a visit to his father's house, Edmund hurried to the home of Mercedes, his fiancée. Meanwhile, his shipmate Danglars sat drinking wine with Edmund's neighbor Caderousse, and with a young man named Fernand, who was also in love with Mercedes. "Let's all drink to Edmond Dantes," Danglars cried, "the man who will soon be the new ship's captain and the husband of the beautiful Mercedes." Fernand threw his glass to the ground at the mention of Dantes. "Mercedes once told me that if Edmund died, she'd kill herself," he said. Well, he doesn't have to die, the cunning Danglers said. What if he was just in prison? Then I could be captain of the ship, he thought. When people get out of prison, they always want revenge, Caderousse said. Anyway, I like Dantes, so let's have no more of this drunken talk. You remember that Dantes delivered a letter to Napoleon on Elba, Danglars went on. What if we tell the king's prosecutor that Dantes is a Bonapartist spy? And if I disguise my handwriting... We denounce Edmond Dantes, Danglars wrote. He carried a letter to Napoleon Bonaparte on Elba and brought back a letter from him to take to his supporters in Paris. If you arrest him, you will find this letter. Then, pretending that he had written it in jest, Danglars crumpled up the letter and threw it away. Taking Caderousse by the arm, he staggered off. But when he glanced back, he saw Fernand picking up the letter. Now we'll let the matter take its course, he muttered. The day of Dantes's marriage to Mercedes dawned fine. Neither of them noticed the strange smile on Fernand's face. As the guests gathered before the marriage ceremony, Fernand wiped large beads of sweat from his brow. Suddenly, 3 knocks sounded at the door, and a commissioner of police came in. "Monsieur Dantes," he shouted, "I arrest you in the name of the law."
"But why?" Dantes asked, his face turning pale. "Oh no," Caderousse whispered to Danglars. "Is this something to do with our joke yesterday? If so, it's a cruel one." "I tore up the letter," Danglars replied. "No, you didn't," Caderousse cried. "You threw it on the ground." "Hold your tongue," Danglars said. "You were too drunk to see anything." As a carriage took Dantes away, a stunned silence fell over the guests, except for the sound of Mercedes weeping. Monsieur Morel, the owner of the ship and Edmond's employer, followed him into Marseille, desperate to find out what was happening. He came back with terrible news. "Well, my friends," he said, shaking his head, "it is more serious than we thought. Edmond is accused of being a secret agent of Napoleon Bonaparte." Mercedes gave a cry. Old Dantes, Edmond's father, sank back in his chair. "So," Caderousse muttered, "you lied to me, Danglars. The trick was played after all." Monsieur de Villefort was as happy as any man could be. At the age of 26, he was now the Crown Prosecutor's deputy in Marseille, and was engaged to be married to a rich and well-connected girl whom he loved. He supported the French king and had no sympathy for any Bonapartists who came his way. When Dantes entered Villefort's office, he was pale, but calm and smiling. "I've done nothing wrong," he thought. "Tell me about yourself," Villefort began, "and your political views. Some say that you support Napoleon." "I'm ashamed to say that I have no political views," Dantes replied. "I have 3 feelings. I love my father, I respect Monsieur Morel, and I adore my fiancée Mercedes. There's little else I can tell you." "Let me have the letter that was given to you on Elba," Villefort said. "Then you will be free to go." "You must have it there with all the papers that were taken from me," Dantes said. "To whom was it addressed?" Villefort asked. Monsieur Noirtier in Paris," Dantes replied. "Do you know him, sir?" The color drained from Villefort's face. "No!" he cried, searching through the pile of papers on his desk. As soon as he had found it, he read it, then threw it onto the fire. "The main evidence against you is that letter," he said. "And as you see, I have destroyed it. Tell nobody about this." Dantes, giving Villefort a look of gratitude, was led from the office to a prison cell. That night, a carriage came for him. Certain that Villefort had sent it to take him home, he got in. But it took him to the quayside, where he was escorted to a boat. "Where are they taking me?" Dantes thought. "Well, I've nothing to fear, for Villefort gave me his word." As they rowed, a strange shape loomed in the darkness. "My God!" Dantes cried. "That's the prison of Chateau d'If. Only political prisoners go there. Why are they taking me to such a terrible place?" Nobody would answer his questions. And later, alone in his dark and damp dungeon, Dantes sank into despair. Chapter 2, Number 34 and Number 27. As a prisoner, Dantes went through every stage of misery. Pride, because he knew that he was innocent. Doubt, because he might be guilty without knowing it. And hope that the guards might let him have books and exercise, or even a cellmate. When all failed, he turned to God. But he still remained a prisoner. Number 34. Dantes was a simple and uneducated man, and had nothing to distract his mind. He cursed aloud and threw himself against the walls of his prison. "My happiness has been destroyed for no reason that I know of," he said to himself. 4 years passed in this way. And, unknown to him, the note in his prison file read, "Edmond Dantes. This prisoner played an active part in Bonaparte's escape from the island of Elba, which led to the overthrow of King Louis XVIII, to be kept in solitary confinement." One night, Dantes heard a scratching sound on his wall, but used to rats, he took little notice. It went on, hour after hour. At last he picked up a stone and knocked 3 times on the wall. When the noise stopped, Dantes felt the hair rise on his neck. "Who are you?" he cried. I am number 27, a voice replied. Dantes began to dig towards the sound. At last, at the bottom of a dark pit behind the wall of Dantes's cell, a white-haired man appeared. He must have been more than 60 years old. He had been a priest, Father Faria, and he had been digging for 3 years. "I've never thought of trying to escape," Dantes told him. "I thought that even if I got outside, there's only a sheer drop to the sea from the rocks. Then I'd have to swim for my life." At night, when the guards were asleep, the 2 men talked in Faria's cell. "Edmond, who would benefit by your disappearance?" Faria asked. "Nobody." Dantes answered all Faria's questions. "Yes, one man on the ship disliked me, Danglars." "Yes, a man named Fernand was in love with Mercedes." "Yes, I saw Danglars, Fernand, and Caderousse drinking together." "Yes, I brought a letter from Elba, but the deputy prosecutor burned it. That was the only thing that could have caused trouble. It was addressed to a Monsieur Noirtier." "And the deputy prosecutor's name?" Faria asked. "Monsieur de Villefort," Dantes replied. Faria gave a bitter laugh. "Oh, my poor young fool," he cried. "Did Villefort make you promise never to speak the name of Noirtier?" Dantes nodded. "Noirtier is Villefort's father," Faria said. "He burned that letter to protect his career. His father is a Bonapartist, and this letter would have damaged Villefort's political progress. He sent you here to be sure of your silence." Dantes gave a cry. He returned to his dungeon and lay on his bed for hours, in silent meditation. Now he thought of only one thing: revenge. Dantes and Faria dug for 15 months to complete their tunnel. As they worked, Faria taught the young man everything he knew: history, physics, languages, mathematics, and much more. One day, Faria told Dantes about an enormous fortune he had inherited, which lay buried on the deserted island of Monte Cristo. "I am not mad, Edmund," he insisted. "My treasure does exist, and if I die before I escape, you shall have it." One night, Edmund heard a cry. When he reached Faria's cell, he saw that his friend was close to death. "Do not forget Monte Cristo," Faria cried, falling back on his bed. "If you manage to escape, enjoy my treasure, for you have suffered enough." As day broke, Dantes saw that his friend was dead. "I don't want to die in prison," he thought. "I want to punish my enemies. But only the dead leave this place. Ah!" And that was how the idea came to Dantes, to change places with his dear old friend in the burial sack, which would be tossed into the sea. Soon, Dantes felt himself flying through the air. Then he plunged like an arrow into icy water. He quickly cut open the sack and the rope that tied him to a cannonball, and rose to the surface. After 14 years of captivity, Dantes was free. It was many months before Dantes reached the island of Monte Cristo, which lay between the islands of Elba and Corsica. Father Faria was right. Hidden deep in the caves, he found more treasure than he could have imagined. Returning to his home in Marseille, he discovered that his father had died. Disguised as a priest called Father Busoni, he went to visit his old friend Caderousse, who now ran an inn on the Bellegarde Road in Beaucaire. "I have come from the deathbed of poor Edmond Dantes, who has died in prison," he said. "He begged me to clear his name and to give this to his dear friends." Father Busoni took a beautiful diamond from his pocket. A friend, an ex-prisoner, left him this when he died. "Tell me, Caderousse, do you know why Dantes was imprisoned? Do you know his friends?" "Yes," Caderousse replied, "and I'll tell you everything, if you promise not to repeat a word, for Edmund's friends are now important people." And in this way, Dantes learned of the letter that Danglars had written, that Danglars was now a rich man because he had made a fortune supplying the French army during the war in Spain, and because of his marriage to a banker's daughter, that Fernand, the poorest of them all, had joined the army and been awarded his title of count, as well as medals for services to his country, and that Mercedes had finally married him. They had a son called Albert. To his sorrow, he learned that Monsieur Morel was on the brink of ruin because his ship was lost at sea. Giving the diamond to Caderousse, Dantes went at once to Monsieur Morel's house, and in secret left money for his dear friend, saving his life and his reputation. "Now I'm free to plot my revenge," he said to himself. "Danglars, Caderousse, Fernand, and above all, Monsieur de Villefort." Chapter 3. The Island of Monte Cristo. At the beginning of 1838, two young French noblemen planned to meet in Rome for the carnival: Franz d'Épinay and the Viscount Albert de Morcerf. Before Albert arrived, Franz decided to visit Elba. On the return journey, the boatman said there was good hunting on a nearby island. "It's called Monte Cristo, sir," he said. "It's deserted, except for smugglers who sometimes shelter there." When they reached the shore, Franz was worried. There were men on the island, but they invited Franz to dine in a luxurious cave. His host was a pale man in oriental clothing, who gave his name as Sinbad the Sailor, because he had traveled a great deal. "Have you suffered, monsieur?" Franz asked. "You have the look of a man who has been persecuted by society." "No, I am the happiest man I know," he replied. "I am as free as a bird. I can go anywhere I choose." After he had eaten and drunk well, Franz fell asleep. When he awoke back on the hillside, he wondered if it had all been a dream. But when he returned to the others, he saw a small boat out to sea, and through his spyglass he saw Sinbad the Sailor waving farewell to him. When Albert de Morcerf arrived in Rome, the two young men decided to visit the ruins of the Colosseum by night. But the innkeeper warned them to take care. The bandit Luigi Vampa often ambushed travelers in the dark. Leaving Albert with a guide, Franz sat in the shadows of the Colosseum to wait. Here he overheard a conversation and was certain that one of the voices belonged to Sinbad the Sailor. He did not sleep well that night, for the thought of that stranger haunted him. The next evening, at the opera, he saw the man again. Another surprise awaited Franz. When he returned to his hotel, he was told that one of the guests, the Count of Monte Cristo, would like to be introduced to them both. As the door opened, Franz remained rooted to the spot. The man who came toward them was the cloaked figure at the Colosseum, the stranger in the box at the opera, and his host on the island of Monte Cristo. On the last night of the carnival, as the candles went out, Albert felt himself being dragged into a carriage. Several hours later, Franz received a ransom note. Albert was being held by the bandit Luigi Vampa. Thanks to the Count of Monte Cristo, Albert was released without payment. But the Count shuddered as Albert shook his hand. "What is wrong, Franz?" Albert asked his friend the next morning. "I must admit that the Count is an odd man, but you seem very cold towards him." Swearing Albert to secrecy, Franz told him about his visit to the island of Monte Cristo. "How does Monte Cristo come to know Luigi Vampa so well?" he asked. "The Count is a rich traveler. That is all," Albert replied. "He bought an island and took its name. And those smugglers in his crew are not thieves, but exiles from their own land. Monte Cristo saved my life, and I shall do all I can for him when he visits Paris in May." Chapter 4. House of Secrets. 3 months later, in Paris, Albert de Morcerf was preparing to receive the Count of Monte Cristo. Several guests had been invited to meet him, including Maximilian Morel, the son of the ship owner who had died some years before. During the conversation, Albert talked of his forthcoming engagement to Eugene Danglars. "Eugene Danglars!" Monte Cristo exclaimed. "Isn't her father now Baron Danglars?" "Yes," Albert replied. When the others had left, Albert showed the Count around his apartment. In the bedroom, Monte Cristo went straight to a portrait on the wall. It showed a young woman of about 25, wearing a red and black bodice, her dark hair held back by gold pins. She was staring sadly at the sea. The Count's cheeks paled. "This is my mother," Albert said. "She had this painting done some years ago, dressed in that fisherwoman's costume. My father does not like it, so I keep it here. My mother cannot look at it without weeping." Albert's father, the Count de Morcerf, welcomed Monte Cristo warmly. But when his wife appeared in the doorway, she turned deadly pale. "I owe you my son's life, sir," she said, staring at him, "and I bless you for that." Monte Cristo bowed, his face even paler than hers. Later, when he had gone, the Countess asked her son, "What is this title of Monte Cristo?" "It is a place, mother," he replied. "The Count bought an island in the Mediterranean Sea, the haunt of smugglers. He is not a nobleman, but his manners are better than many noblemen I have met. Yes, he is a remarkable man." "Do you like him?" his mother asked. "Yes, even though France dislikes him," Albert said. "He thinks that Monte Cristo is a ghost returned from the dead." His mother shrank back in terror. "Take care, Albert," she whispered. Monte Cristo had bought a house in Auteuil, on the outskirts of Paris. As he and his servant, Bertuccio, approached it, his servant became more and more nervous. Night had fallen, and the house had a gloomy air. "What was the name of the man who owned this house?" Monte Cristo asked the caretaker. "The Marquis de Saint-Méran," the man replied. "He had an only daughter, whom he married to Monsieur de Villefort, the king's prosecutor." Bertuccio was paler than the wall against which he was leaning. After looking around the house, the Count asked to see the garden. "No, no!" Bertuccio cried. "I can't go there. If only you'd told me this was the house you'd bought. It's the house of murder. It was an act of revenge. He fell just there, beside the hole where he'd buried his child." "Who?" the Count asked. "Monsieur de Villefort." "Impossible," the Count replied. "Well, Bertuccio, you must tell me what happened." "It all goes back to 1815, Bertuccio began. "My brother was murdered, and I went to Villefort to ask him to investigate the crime. But he refused, because my brother supported Napoleon. I threatened to kill him. When he moved to Paris, I followed him. I often saw him walking in the garden of this house with a pregnant woman. One night, I took out my dagger and waited. As midnight struck, Villefort came from the house alone. But he began to dig a hole, in which he placed a small box. I leapt at him, stabbing him and shouting my name. He fell at once. I grabbed the box and ran. Inside was a baby. I breathed air into his lungs, and life came back to him. My brother's wife decided to take him in. She brought him up, although he grew into a wicked child. We named him Benedetto." "You should have returned the child to its mother, Bertuccio," the Count replied. "That was your true crime." "I'd gone back to smuggling after my brother's death," Bertuccio continued, "and I planned to ask a sea captain to take the boy on. One night, I went to my usual inn, run by a man called Caderousse." "When was that?" "June, 1829. But Caderousse had a visitor, a jeweler who'd come to buy a diamond that a priest named Father Busoni had given him. Well, in short, Caderousse murdered his wife and the jeweler and made off with the money and the diamond. The police found me hiding there and blamed me for the murder. You know the rest. Father Busoni rescued me from prison and found me work with you." "What happened to Benedetto?" Monte Cristo asked. "He ended up in prison," Bertuccio shuddered. "He stole from my sister-in-law and set fire to her house. I hope he's dead, and I still do not know if Villefort died at my feet." "Anything is possible," the Count muttered. Chapter 5. The trap tightens. The Count of Monte Cristo was visiting Baron Danglars at his mansion. A look of disgust passed over his face. "He looks like a snake and a vulture at the same time," he thought. Danglars took a letter from his pocket. "I have a letter to my bank asking me to lend you as much money as you need while you are in France," he said. "I do not understand, monsieur." "Why not?" the Count asked. "My bank lends me as much money as I need. Why does your bank not do the same?" "Do not worry, monsieur, we shall meet your needs." Danglars wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Even if you were to ask for 1,000,000 francs." "What use would 1,000,000 be to me?" the Count asked, taking 1,000,000 francs in bonds from his pocket. Danglars reeled with shock. "I shall need to borrow 6,000,000 francs a year," he finished. "Very well," Danglars replied, choking. "Now, you must meet my wife." And it was the Baroness Danglars who told Monte Cristo that her friend, Madame de Villefort, had asked to borrow her young and frisky horses for a carriage ride to Auteuil the very next day. That evening, Monte Cristo left for Auteuil. The next afternoon, the Count summoned his servant Ali. "I hear that you are skilled with the lasso," the Count said. "Could you stop 2 horses in their tracks right outside my house? They will be pulling a carriage." Ali nodded. At 5 o'clock, the sound of horses' hooves thundered in the distance. The horses were out of control. Inside the carriage, a woman clutched her young son to her in terror. As soon as the horses approached the Count's house, Ali took a lasso from his pocket and threw it around one of the horse's legs, bringing it to the ground. Monte Cristo rushed to the carriage and took the mother and child inside. "I am Madame Heloise de Villefort," the woman whispered, "and this is my son, Edouard. How can I thank you for saving us?" The incident became the talk of Paris that evening. Monsieur de Villefort got into his coach and set off for the Count's house. He had married again after the death of his first wife and had a daughter, Valentine, from his first marriage, as well as little Edouard. To his friends, he was a powerful protector. To his enemies, he was silent and without feeling. This was the same man whom Edmond Dantes had faced in Marseille in 1815. Although his pale skin was now yellow, his eyes sunken. He was dressed in black, except for a red ribbon in his buttonhole, like a line of blood. Monte Cristo greeted him with an icy coldness. After receiving Villefort's thanks, they talked about justice and the law. "So you believe that human nature is weak," Villefort said, "and that every man has committed some error?" "Some error or crime," the Count replied. Villefort turned the talk to his father, Monsieur Noirtier de Villefort, who was now paralyzed after a stroke. "I believe he was struck down by God for his sins," Villefort said. Monte Cristo had a smile on his lips, but he gave a silent scream that would have put Villefort to flight if he had heard it. "Yes, Villefort still lives," he thought, "and my heart is still full of poison." Chapter 6. Money, Love, and Hate. In the beautiful garden of Monsieur de Villefort's house, Valentine Villefort was in secret conversation with Maximilian Morrel. The 2 young people were very much in love, in spite of the fact that Villefort was planning to marry her to Franz d'Épinay. "Valentine, I have told nobody about my feelings for you," Morrel said, "but I long to tell that extraordinary man I met last week at Albert's. You know him too. He saved your stepmother's life." "The Count of Monte Cristo?" she cried, shuddering. "No, a friend of hers cannot be a friend of mine." "But he also rescued Albert de Morcerf from the bandits," Morel replied. "He obviously has the power to influence what will happen." "What has he done for you?" Valentine asked. "Nothing I know of," Morel replied. "But like the sun, he warms me just by being there." As this conversation was taking place, Villefort had gone to talk to his father about Valentine's marriage. Noirtier was violently opposed to it. When Valentine came to join them, she embraced the old man. "I too am very unhappy about this marriage, grandfather," she said. "I do not love Franz d'Épinay." Noirtier's eyes filled with tears. He indicated that a solicitor should be brought to the house so that he could change his will. If Valentine married Franz, she would inherit nothing of his great fortune. Villefort was the first to break the astonished silence at the news. "I am the master of my daughter," he said. "I want her to marry Franz d'Épinay, so she will marry him. I do not care about your will, father." Valentine fell into a chair, weeping. An unfashionable man of about 52, a Major Cavalcanti, arrived at Monte Cristo's house in Paris. He had been summoned there by a letter from Father Busoni, telling him that Monte Cristo had found his son, Andrea. The poor child had been kidnapped at the age of 5, 15 years earlier. The Count greeted him warmly, gave him money and new clothes, and the baptismal certificate of his son.
The Count of Monte Cristo, 2. Alexander Dumas.
Andrea Cavalcanti, who had also been summoned by a letter, this time from Sinbad the Sailor, was a tall young man with blond hair and a reddish beard and dark eyes. He was very ready to take up the large fortune the Count had promised him, on condition that Andrea stayed in Paris. Sinbad the Sailor is an eccentric English friend of mine called Lord Wilmore, Monte Cristo explained. Monte Cristo left the father and son alone. "Do you understand what is going on?" old Cavalcante asked in Italian. "Good heavens, no," Andrea replied. "All this has been planned to fool someone," the old man said. "But not you or me, so why worry?" Andrea replied.
The next morning, Monte Cristo rode out of Paris to a telegraph station used for sending messages. There, with bundles of banknotes, he bribed the telegraph man to send an incorrect message to the French government that the King of Spain had escaped from his exile and that a rebellion was about to break out in Spain. When Danglars heard of this from a friend, he quickly sold the shares he held in the Spanish government. But the very next day, the report was said to be false. Poor Danglars! As the share prices rose, he lost about 1,000,000 francs by selling his shares, which he didn't need to do. Once more, Monte Cristo smiled with quiet satisfaction. Chapter 7. Ghosts from the Past. The gloomy house in Auteuil, which had been empty for 25 years, had come to life, because Monte Cristo was giving a party for his new friends. When Danglars arrived, the Baron's face was pale, as if he had just stepped from his tomb. When Villefort arrived, Monte Cristo felt his hand tremble in their handshake. Bertuccio appeared in the doorway to count the guests for dinner. "Oh, my God," he whispered to his master. "The Baroness Danglars! That's her! The woman who was pregnant!" Then he saw Villefort. "So I didn't kill him!" "No, your dagger must have missed his heart," the Count replied. "Do not forget that young man in the black coat.
He is Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti."
"Benedetto," Bertuccio whispered.
And Monte Cristo silenced him with a cold look. After the meal, which was magnificent, the Count showed the guests around his house. "There is a room upstairs which is very sinister," he said. "Come, let me show you." This room was unlit and hung with blood-red tapestries. Villefort's face was ashen. Madame Danglars slumped into a chair. "And there's a small staircase leading to the garden," Monte Cristo said. "You can imagine a crime being committed here." Madame Danglars almost fainted at his words. Villefort leaned against a wall. "You're terrifying the ladies, Count," he cried. "Good Lord," Monte Cristo said. "Then let us imagine this room to be that of a respectable mother of a family." At his words, Madame Danglars fainted away. When she had recovered, Monte Cristo took her arm and led her down to the garden. "There really was a crime committed here," he said, taking Villefort's arm too. "Here, in this very spot, while my men were digging, they found the skeleton of a newborn child." "Who says it was a crime?" Villefort asked, his voice trembling. Seeing that his guests could bear no more, Monte Cristo had coffee served, and shortly afterward they left for home. As Andrea Cavalcanti climbed into his carriage, a hand touched his shoulder. He half turned and saw a man with a mocking smile, who called him Benedetto and got into the carriage beside him. "Take care, Caderousse," Andrea said. "Monte Cristo has found my father." "Your real father?" "No, but I do not care," the young man laughed, "as long as he gives me what I want." "And as long as you give me what I want," Caderousse replied, "let's say 200 francs a month to keep me quiet, eh?" "Alas," Andrea said with a sigh, "one can never be completely happy in this world." The next day, after a sleepless night, Baroness Danglars made her way to Villefort's office. "You will agree that if I did make a mistake, I was severely punished for it last night," she wept. "You must be brave, madam," Villefort replied. "It is not ended yet. You only see the past, but the future may be terrible and stained with blood." Madame Danglars stifled a cry. "How has this terrible past been brought alive?" Villefort asked. "Not by chance. Listen, I must tell you what I could not tell you all those years ago. Many months later, when I had recovered from my wounds, when I discovered that you had married Danglars, I went back to the garden at Auteuil. I found nothing. Nothing! The box had vanished." "Vanished?" Madame Danglars could hardly speak in her horror. "Oh, my poor child!" "Do you understand now?" Villefort asked. "The child must be alive. Somebody shares our secret. And if Monte Cristo knows the spot, then he knows our secret." He looked at Madame Danglars. "I warn you against him," he whispered. "By the end of this week, I shall find out who Monte Cristo is, where he comes from, where he is going to, and why he tells us about a child dug up in his garden." Villefort spoke these words in a tone of voice that would have made Monte Cristo shudder if he had heard them. Chapter 8. Meetings in the Dark. After the dinner at Monte Cristo's house, Madame Danglars could not think of the Count without trembling, and Villefort could find out very little about him, except that Father Busoni and Lord Wilmore were his close friends. But neither of the men, who both happened to be in Paris, could tell him anything more. The hot days of July brought an important social event, the ball of Albert de Morcerf. When Monte Cristo came in, everybody stared. It was not just his black coat and white vest which attracted attention, but his face, calm and innocent, his curly black hair, his sad eyes, and most of all, his mouth, which could so easily show contempt. Albert's mother could not take her eyes off him. At last, she asked him to walk with her in the garden. Monte Cristo seemed to stagger for a moment. Outside, she clasped his arm with both hands. The Count turned as pale as death. "Monsieur," the Countess said, "is it true that you have seen much, traveled far, and suffered deeply?" "Yes. I loved a girl and was going to marry her," the Count replied. "But the war came and swept me from her world. When I came back, she was married." "Yes," she whispered. "We only love once in our life. Did you ever see her again?" "Never," he replied. "And have you forgiven her?" Mercedes asked. "I think so," he replied, "but only her, not those who separated us." Valentine was called away from the ball by the news of the death of the Marquis de Saint-Méran, her maternal grandfather. His death was swiftly followed by the death of his wife. The doctor confided his terrible thoughts to Villefort, that both of them had been poisoned. As soon as the burials had taken place, Villefort arranged for the marriage contract to be signed. While the lawyers set out the papers, Noirtier asked to see Franz. "Here he is, father," Villefort said. "I am sure that your opposition to this marriage will disappear once you have spoken to him." Noirtier gave a look that turned Villefort's blood to ice. Letters were taken from a secret drawer and given to Franz to read. They told him about his father's death. He was killed in a duel when Franz was only 2 years old, because he supported the King of France, not Napoleon. "In heaven's name, sir," Franz begged Noirtier, "tell me the name of the man who killed my poor father." "It was me," Noirtier indicated. Franz slumped into a chair, and hours later he withdrew from his engagement to Valentine. Old Noirtier changed his will once more to allow Valentine to inherit his fortune. He also planned to leave Villefort's house. Valentine would live with him until she was 21, when she would marry Morel. Now happiness was in their grasp at last. The marriage arrangements between Eugene Danglars and Albert de Morcerf were also progressing badly. Baron Danglars had withdrawn his consent because of a newspaper article which tarnished the reputation of Albert's father, Fernand. Albert was led to believe that Monte Cristo was responsible. At once, Andrea Cavalcanti declared his interest in marrying Eugene. When he went to give Caderousse his money, his friend laughed. "Huh! So you're marrying the daughter of my old friend Danglars," he cried. "I need more money, Benedetto. Tell me the layout of your Count's house, and I'll pay him a surprise visit in the dark." That night, Monte Cristo watched a man enter his house through an upstairs window. But as a ray of light shone across the thief's face, he whispered in surprise, "Well, it's my old friend." At once, he changed into priest's clothes, putting on a metal chain vest under his robe. Then he took a candle and opened the door. "Good evening, dear Monsieur Caderousse," he said. "What the devil are you doing here at this hour, my fine murderer?" "Father Busoni!" Caderousse cried, staring in horror. "It must be almost 10 years since you brought me that diamond." He came closer. I won't go back to prison, he cried, striking the priest's chest with his dagger, but it fell to the ground. The Count gripped Caderousse's arm. Now write down exactly what I say, he ordered. With a trembling hand, Caderousse wrote the following: To Baron Danglars, the man to whom you are to marry your daughter, Andrea Cavalcanti, is an escaped prisoner called Benedetto. Monte Cristo took the letter and let Caderousse escape. But as Caderousse climbed over the wall, a man came from the shadows and stabbed him. With his dying breath, Caderousse told the priest that Benedetto had murdered him, and signed a note to that effect. The Count held up his candle. Look carefully, Caderousse, he whispered. He took off his wig and let down his long black hair. Go back to your earliest memories. Yes, Caderousse gasped. I did know you once. Who are you? The Count bent over the dying man and whispered in his ear, Edmond Dantes. Oh, my God, forgive me, Caderousse cried. And when the doctor and Villefort arrived, they found Father Busoni praying over the dead man. Albert de Morcerf confronted Monte Cristo at the opera. White and trembling, he rushed into the Count's box, where the Count was sitting with Morrel. I have come for an explanation, sir, he cried. Why have you insulted my father so publicly? I do not know what you mean, the Count replied. Albert took off his glove and would have thrown it at the Count's feet to challenge him to a duel, if Morrel had not grabbed his wrist. Monsieur Albert, Monte Cristo said in a terrifying voice, I shall send your glove back to you wrapped around a bullet. By tomorrow morning, I shall have killed you. Chapter 9. A Mother's Love. As Monte Cristo was preparing his pistols that night, a veiled woman was shown into his room. It is not Madame de Morcerf who has come to you, Edmond, she whispered. It is Mercedes. Mercedes is dead to me, madam, he replied. Mercedes is alive, she insisted, and she recognized your voice as soon as she heard it. I knew it was you who had insulted Monsieur de Morcerf. Fernand, you mean, madam? The Count said, full of hatred. If you want to take your revenge, take it on me, Edmond, she replied. I do not know why you were arrested on our wedding day. Monte Cristo handed Mercedes the letter that Danglars had written that February day. It cost me a great deal of money, he said, but it is worth it to prove to you that I am taking my revenge on Fernand the fisherman, not on Fernand the general. When Mercedes had read the letter, she fell to her knees. Forgive me, she cried. I still love you, Edmond. I must have my revenge, Monte Cristo cried. A shudder of fear ran through Mercedes' body. But not on my son, Edmond. Spare him, she begged. Fernand's son insulted me in public, Monte Cristo replied, and the duel will take place. He looked at Mercedes and sighed. But I shall let your son kill me, madam, for your sake. Thank you, she cried. Goodbye, Edmond. The Count gave a bitter smile. How quickly she accepted, he thought. She cares more for her son than she does for me. I shall not regret my death, but I regret that my revenge, so carefully plotted through these long years, will be destroyed, all because my heart still feels love for Mercedes. Albert was late for the duel. He was pale and had not slept all night. Monsieur, he said in an unsteady voice, you were right to take your revenge on my father, now that my mother has told me what he did to you so many years ago. It was like a thunderbolt. Monte Cristo stared at him in astonishment. Then, with tears in his eyes, he shook Albert's hand. Mercedes has saved my life by confessing that terrible family secret, he thought. What courage she has! But Monte Cristo's troubles were not finished. Albert's father came straight to his house, declaring his desire to fight in place of his son. "I do not know you, but I hate you," Fernand de Morcerf cried. "I want to know your true name before I plunge my sword into your heart." Monte Cristo's eyes burned with anger. He rushed from the room and came back wearing a sailor's uniform like the one he had worn on board his ship. "Fernand," he cried, "you can guess my name, can't you? Look at my face, now that it is lit up by the joy of revenge. You must have seen it often in your dreams since your marriage to my fiancée Mercedes." The general, with a look of horror, cried, "Edmond Dantes!" He dragged himself out to his carriage, and as soon as he reached home, he shot himself. Meanwhile, in the Villefort household, Valentine was taken ill with suspected poisoning with the same medicine her grandfather took. Only then did Morrel reveal to Monte Cristo how much he loved her. Only then did old Noirtier indicate that he had long feared this and had for many weeks given his granddaughter some of his own medicine to drink. In this way, he protected her against a possible overdose. Thanks to her grandfather, Valentine did not die, although she remained very ill. One night, she saw Monte Cristo leaning over her bed. "Do not be afraid," he whispered. "I am watching over you for Maximilian, and I have seen who has been poisoning you every night. I have poured away that poison. Pretend to be asleep, and you will see, too." Valentine did as the Count asked, and after midnight she saw her stepmother pouring out her nightly poison and creeping from her bedroom. "Let me escape from this house," she wept when the Count returned. "She will follow you wherever you go, Valentine," Monte Cristo replied. "She wants your fortune for her son. Now you must do what I ask if you wish to live." "Monsieur, I love Maximilian, and therefore I will do anything to stay alive," she replied. "Then swallow this tablet," he whispered, "and fear nothing. I shall be watching over you." The marriage contract between Eugene Danglars and Andrea Cavalcanti was to be signed at 9 o'clock in the evening. As guests gathered for the occasion, talk turned to the murder at Monte Cristo's house. In fact, the police found a letter on the murdered man, addressed to you, Baron, the Count said. Andrea's face turned pale. The murdered man was named Caderousse. When Danglars called for Andrea to sign the contract, he had already slipped from the room. Soon afterward, 2 policemen entered, demanding to see him. "But why do you want him?" Danglars asked. "He's an ex-convict who's murdered Caderousse," one of the policemen explained. "They were in prison together." After this shocking news, Eugene Danglars ran away in the middle of the night. "Fortunately you are rich, Baron Danglars," Monte Cristo said, "and your fortune does not depend upon your daughter's marriage." "Ah, yes, I am still rich," the Baron boasted. "In fact, I am about to take out 5,000,000 francs in cash from my bank to settle some urgent debts. Can you believe it?" "Well, I can test it for myself," Monte Cristo replied, smiling. "You remember I have a credit limit of 6,000,000 francs with you. Well, I have already borrowed almost 1,000,000, but I am in great need of money at the moment. Let me have the other 5,000,000 today." Danglars was stricken with terror. He laughed nervously. "My bank does not have 10,000,000 francs," he thought. "Now I face ruin." Tragedy had befallen both the Danglars and the Villaforts. But the Villafort tragedy was greater, for Valentine was suddenly found dead. At her burial in the family tomb, Morrel was pale and silent, since only Monte Cristo knew his secret love for her. The Count hurried from the burial to Morrel's house. He found him planning to kill himself. "I will prevent you," Monte Cristo said. "Who are you to think you have such power?" Morrel asked. "Who am I?" the Count asked. "I am the only man who can say, 'I do not want your father's son to die today.'" "Why do you mention my father?" "I was the man who saved his life 10 years ago today, on the 5th of September," Monte Cristo replied. "He was going to kill himself because he had lost all his money. Maximilian, I was the man who sent money to him, although he did not know it had come from me. I am Edmond Dantès." Morrel shrank back, astonished. "Have no fear, sir," he whispered. "I shall no longer look for death, but my grief will kill me anyway." "You will thank me one day for saving your life," the Count said. "But if, in a month from today, I have not cured you of your grief, I shall give you the same poison that killed Valentine." Chapter 10. Too Much Revenge. On a splendid autumn day, Andrea Cavalcanti, also known as Benedetto, was brought to trial in Paris. Villefort was the chief prosecutor. Before he left for court, he demanded to speak to his wife. "Where do you keep the poison that has killed my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, and my daughter?" he asked. She shrank back from him. "So you do not deny it?" he cried. "I repeat, where is your poison?" "Oh, sir, you cannot want me to kill myself," his wife wept. "I do not want you to be executed in public," he replied. "I am on my way to court to try one murderer. If you are not dead by the time I come back, I shall have you arrested." Villefort was as pale as death when Benedetto was brought into court. "Where were you born?" the judge asked the accused. "Auteuil, near Paris," Benedetto replied. "What is your name?" "I cannot tell it," the accused replied, "but I know my father's name." He paused. "It is Monsieur de Villefort." A cry rose from the crowd like a peal of thunder. "My father told my mother that I was dead," he went on, "and he buried me alive in the garden. Somebody saw him. That is how I know. I do not know my mother's name, but she has done nothing wrong." Madame Danglars fell to the ground, screaming. "Everything this young man has said is true," Villefort whispered, rising to his feet. His teeth chattered like a man with a fever as he staggered towards the door. Everybody was speechless. It was a terrible end to all the events that had shaken Parisian society for more than 2 weeks. At his house, Villefort broke open the door of the bedroom where his wife fell dying at his feet. In the next room, he found the body of his young son. He staggered on to his father's rooms, his hair standing on end with shock. There he found him with Father Busoni. "So you are here, monsieur," Villefort cried. "Do you always appear when there is death in my house?" "I have come to tell you that you have paid your debt to me," the priest said. "My God!" Villefort cried. "That is not the voice of Father Busoni." As he watched, Busoni tore off his wig and shook his black hair over his shoulders. "That is the face of Monte Cristo!" "Think further back, Villefort," the Count said. "You are not Busoni. You are not Monte Cristo," Villefort muttered. "You condemned me to a slow and terrible death," Monte Cristo whispered. "You deprived me of love as well as my freedom. I'm the ghost of that man you locked up almost 24 years ago." "You are," Villefort began, "Edmond Dantes." Villefort cried, dragging him towards his apartment. "Then look, Edmond Dantes! Look at the bodies of my wife and child! Now you have your revenge!" Monte Cristo turned pale. "That poor child," he thought. "I have taken my revenge too far." On arriving home, the Count sent for Morrel. "Get ready, Maximilian," he said. "We shall leave Paris tomorrow." "Have you nothing more to do here?" Morrel asked. "No," Monte Cristo replied. "I have done too much already. Now I have plans to carry out elsewhere. Meet me on the island of Monte Cristo on the 5th day of October, Maximilian. There I shall keep my promise to you. If you still grieve for Valentine, I shall give you poison." Baron Danglars, escaping his ruin in Paris, had reached Italy, where he planned to live on the money he had taken with him. But outside Rome, he was kidnapped by Luigi Vampa and paid so dearly for his food while in captivity that his money ran out. "Do you repent for the evil you have done?" a voice asked. Danglars saw a cloaked man standing in the shadows of the cave in which he was held. "Yes," Danglars whispered in terror. "Then I pardon you," the man said. He stepped forward and threw off his cloak. "The Count of Monte Cristo?" Danglars cried. "I am not the Count of Monte Cristo. I am the man you betrayed all those years ago. I am Edmond Dantes." Danglars gave a cry and fell to the ground. And when he looked up, he saw only a shadow disappearing from his sight. Monte Cristo returned to his father's house in Marseille. At the Count's request, Mercédès was living there alone, for Albert had joined the army. "I was the guilty one, Edmond," Mercédès wept. "The others acted out of greed, hatred, and selfishness, but I was a coward. I should not have married Fernand." She touched his hand and looked to the sky. "Farewell, dear Edmond. Let us hope we meet after death," she said. Monte Cristo went from Mercédès to the Château d'If, as he had done so many years before on that February night. It was no longer a prison. Only a caretaker remained there. The Count went to see his old cell, and the tunnel he had dug to reach Father Faria. "Are there any interesting tales told of this awful place?" he asked. "Oh, yes," the caretaker replied. "In 1829, a prisoner escaped by hiding in a burial sack. The guards heard a terrible cry as it hit the water. Poor man, he would have drowned." "Did they know his name?" the Count asked. "Number 34, the caretaker replied. On the 5th of October, a yacht brought Maximilian Morrel to the island of Monte Cristo. The Count was waiting to greet him, and he saw that the young man was still pale with grief. Monte Cristo kept his promise. At midnight, Morrel swallowed the potion to end his grief. But, to his surprise, he awoke the next morning to find Valentine by his side. "The Count of Monte Cristo saved me too," she whispered. "He gave me a potion to make me appear dead." As they stood looking out to sea, they saw a white sail on the horizon. "Monte Cristo has gone," Morrel cried. "Farewell, my friend. Will we ever meet again?" "My dearest," Valentine said, "the Count has taught us one thing, that we must remember these 2 words, wait and hope." Tarzan of the Apes 1. Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 1. The White Ape.
One sunny morning in 1888, a young man named John Clayton Lord Greystoke sailed from England to work in West Africa. When he and his wife Alice reached Africa, they boarded a boat to take them further along the coast. They never arrived. The sailors stole the boat and left the young couple on a deserted beach close to the jungle. Lord and Lady Greystoke watched them row away.
"Oh, John!" Alice Clayton cried. "What are we going to do? What about the child we are expecting?"
"Somebody will come searching for us," her husband replied. "And while we wait, we must be brave, Alice."
There were trees close to the beach. Clayton tied some of their branches together to make a platform between them, with a roof and walls. By dusk, they were safe in their tree room, watching the darkening shadows of the jungle. Alice grasped her husband's arm.
"John, look," she whispered. "What is that? Is it a man?"
Clayton turned to look. He saw a tall figure on a hill, silhouetted against the moon.
"It is only a shadow," he replied.
Clayton kept watch all night, clutching his rifle and revolvers and listening to the screams of wild animals. The sailors had left them with all their belongings, boxes full of clothes and books and tools, as well as biscuits and a barrel of fresh water. The next day, after breakfast, Clayton started to build a small cabin about 100 yards from the beach. Soon they were comfortable there, and they even slept well at night. In the following weeks, Clayton and his wife caught sight of tall, man-like creatures, like the one they had seen that first night. But they never came close to their cabin. One afternoon, when Clayton was chopping down a tree, he caught sight of a large shape making its way toward him. It was an ape, growling as it moved.
"Go inside, Alice," he called.
He started to swing his axe at the beast. As she entered the cabin, his wife looked back in terror. The ape was now standing between the cabin and Clayton. It was an enormous male with nasty, close-set eyes. He bared his great fangs in a horrible snarl. The ape snatched the axe from Clayton's hands and hurled it away. Alice picked up a revolver and fired. The ape ran roaring toward her. Then it fell to the ground, dead. That night, a son was born in that tiny cabin. Lady Greystoke never recovered from the shock of the great ape's attack. She never went outside the cabin again. John Clayton did all he could to make her life comfortable. Animal skins warmed the floors and walls. Clay vases held beautiful flowers. Curtains of bamboo and grass covered the windows. He read to his wife and child from the books they had brought from England. During this time, Clayton wrote a diary in French of their strange life, which he kept in a little metal box. In the following year, great apes attacked them many times, but Clayton always carried a gun, and he always killed them. In the jungle, old Kerchak, the king of the apes, was angry. He was the biggest ape of the tribe, and in his tribe there were 8 ape families, about 70 apes in all. Kerchak was thinking about that animal on the beach with the thunder stick, the animal that often killed members of his tribe. How he wanted to sink his teeth into its neck. As he paced up and down, he caught sight of a young ape called Kala. She was returning from a search for food with her baby, her first child. When she saw how angry Kerchak was, she jumped into the next tree. But the leap loosened the baby at her neck, and it fell to the ground 30 feet below. Kerchak ordered the apes to follow him to the beach. Kala carried her dead baby on her chest. At noon, they reached the ridge overlooking the tiny cabin. That same morning, Lady Alice did not wake up. She had died in her sleep. John Clayton wept for her and wrote in his diary, "My little son is crying for his milk. Oh, Alice, Alice, what shall I do?" As he wept for his wife, the apes crept forward. They opened the door of the cabin and went in. Clayton rose from the table and faced them, but Kerchak squeezed the life out of him. Kala ran to the crying baby and picked it up, dropping the body of her dead baby into the cradle. Hunger worked its charm. Soon the son of an English lord and an English lady was feeding from Kala the ape. She named her baby Tarzan, which meant white skin. Kala nursed her little orphan and wondered why he was not as strong as the other baby apes. How stupid he was! He could not even find his own food. Her husband, Tublat, whom everybody called Broken Nose, hated Tarzan.
"He will never be a great ape," he grumbled to Kala. "You will always have to look after him. Leave him to die."
"No, Broken Nose," she replied. By the time Tarzan was 10 years old, he was more cunning than his brothers and sisters, although he was smaller and less strong than them. But he could swing from branch to branch like them and drop 20 feet at a time to the ground. He could braid ropes from the creepers. He was happy because he had known no other life. But Tarzan was starting to realize that he was different from the other apes. He was ashamed because he was hairless. One day he went to a little lake to drink with one of his cousins. As he leaned over the water, he noticed his reflection for the first time. He was shocked. "I knew that my body was hairless," he thought, "but look at my teeth. They are so small. And my nose is pinched and thin. I wish I had wide nostrils like the others." As he stared at himself, he did not hear Saber, the lioness, creeping toward them. Not until she roared. His cousin froze in horror as the lioness pounced on him. Tarzan, because he was a human being, was able to think, "I would be safer in the water." So Tarzan jumped into the lake, although he could not swim. By splashing his arms and legs, he stayed afloat. Then Tarzan raised his voice in the call for help used by the apes. 40 or 50 of them came rushing through the trees to chase Saber away. From then on, Tarzan enjoyed swimming every day. Kala watched him in surprise because apes do not like water except to drink. And from that day, Tarzan never forgot that Saber was his enemy. Chapter 2. Reading and Writing. Tarzan's tribe of apes roamed 25 miles along the coast and about 50 miles inland to find food. They often came close to the silent cabin by the sea. The other apes kept their distance, remembering the thunderstick. But Tarzan was not afraid. One day, he went in. He stared in astonishment. In the middle of the floor lay a skeleton. On the bed was another, and a tiny skeleton lay in the cradle. Tarzan was used to seeing dead animals, and he was not upset. He examined everything: strange tools and weapons, paper, clothing, and in a cupboard, a book with brightly colored pictures. Under the pictures were black marks that looked like insects. A is for archer. B is for boy. M is for monkey. He did not find a picture that looked like Kala or Kerchak, but he found a picture of Saber under L is for lion. Tarzan looked at the book until it was almost dark. Then he locked it away again, picked up a knife, and left. He had never enjoyed himself so much. As Tarzan stepped back into the jungle, an enormous shape loomed from the shadows. It was Bolgani, the huge gorilla, and gorillas were the great enemy of his tribe. There is no time to run, Tarzan thought. Now I shall have to fight for my life. Tarzan beat the gorilla's body with his fists, and by chance, he caught him with the blade of the knife. Bolgani shrieked with pain. Tarzan thrust the knife again and again into its body as they rolled on the ground. Kala, hearing the sound of battle, came to help. In the moonlight, she found Tarzan's torn little body, and beside him, the dead gorilla. It took Tarzan many days to recover his strength, and as soon as he could, he went back to find the knife. He knew that it was a useful new weapon. Then he decided to go inside the cabin again to look at the picture book. Tarzan squatted on the tabletop in his father's cabin. His smooth brown body bent over the book, his long black hair falling over his eyes. In this way, he learned to read. From the dictionary, he learned that he was a man. Now he was no longer ashamed of his hairless body and his human face. The other apes knew that Tarzan was different. The older males took no notice of him. Some of them hated him, his father, Tublat, most of all. But one day, when he was about 13, Tarzan earned the respect of the tribe. That day, the apes had gathered in an open space to celebrate the killing of a great enemy ape. Kerchak beat his breast with his hairy paws. His terrible shriek rang out across the land. Then the apes danced around the dead beast before they began to eat it. Tarzan used his knife to cut off a whole forearm and took it into a tree. Tublat followed Tarzan to steal his meat, but he could not reach him. Tublat went mad with rage and attacked some of the females, including Kala. Tarzan hurried down the tree and threw himself in between them. With a roar, Tublat leaped upon little Lord Greystoke, but his fangs never tore his flesh. Tarzan plunged the knife into Tublat's hairy throat. Then he placed his foot on the neck of his lifelong enemy, threw back his head, and beat his breast. "I am Tarzan!" he screamed in their language. "I am Tarzan of the apes!" Nothing changed in Tarzan's wild life for several years. He grew stronger and wiser. He learned from his books about the strange world that lay outside his jungle. He hunted the animals, and sometimes they hunted him. He made friends with Tantor, the elephant, and often rode upon his back. Sometimes he came across his enemy Saber and tried to catch her with his rope, but she always escaped. By the time he was 17, Tarzan could read all the books in the cabin. He found pencils, too, and copied the words. By the age of 18, he was an English lord who could speak no English, yet he could read and write it. He had never seen another human being because high hills shut off the jungle on 3 sides, and the ocean on the other. But one day, Tarzan's safe life disappeared forever. Chapter 3: King of the Apes. The Mbonga tribe was running away from the white men who had come to Africa to look for rubber and ivory. Now they had built a new village close to Kerchak's tribe. Kala, hunting for food, came face to face with Kulonga, the chief's son. He fired a poisoned arrow at her, and she plunged to the ground with a loud scream. Tarzan, hearing the noise, knew that something terrible had happened. He found the apes screeching around the body of his dead mother. He roared and beat his chest with his fists and fell across her body. He sobbed. Tarzan felt the same love for her that any boy would feel for his mother. Then Tarzan sped through the treetops, clutching his hunting knife and rope. His heart beat fast. A is for archer, he thought. The arrow in Kala's body is like the one in my picture book. Am I hunting somebody like me? A man? After about a mile, Tarzan came across Kulonga. He was about to shoot his arrow at a wild boar. Tarzan looked at him in amazement. They were so alike, except for the other man's face and color. To Tarzan's surprise, the small wooden stick killed the boar. Kulonga cut its flesh with a knife, built a fire, and cooked it. Tarzan had never seen fire, except when lightning sometimes destroyed a tree. How can this man make red and yellow fangs that turn wood to dust? He asked himself. I must watch and learn. Tarzan followed Kulonga all that day, and that night he crept down from his tree and stole his bow and arrows. Then he tracked Kulonga again. He wanted to find out where he had come from. Suddenly, they came to a clearing. In it stood a village of thatched huts, surrounded by fields of plants. Quickly, before Kulonga could leave the jungle, Tarzan threw the rope around his neck. Then he dragged him back into the trees and killed him. Tarzan's savage life had taught him only one thing. These other people were enemies. To kill was the law of the world in which he had lived. Now I have punished my mother's killer, he thought. He lowered Kulonga to the ground. Then, curious, he made his way to a part of the jungle that was closer to the thatched huts. He watched. Naked children played outside. Women were grinding dried grass, and other women gathered plants in the fields. They wore grass around their hips and metal around their arms and necks and in their noses. A woman worked right under the tree where Tarzan was crouching. She was dipping arrows into a thick red liquid. Tarzan knew nothing of poison, but he knew that a small arrow could not have killed the wild boar. His intelligence told him that this liquid was to blame. Suddenly, he heard a loud cry coming from the place where he had killed Kulonga. Everybody left their work and ran to see what had happened. Tarzan took his chance. He dropped from the tree, picked up a bow and some arrows, and hurried away from the village of Mbonga. Tarzan practiced hard until he learned how to shoot an arrow straight. But soon his arrows were all used up. I shall have to go back to the black man's village, he thought. During this time, Tarzan found something else that was important too. At the back of a cupboard in the cabin, he found a small metal box. Inside was a photograph of a young man, a locket on a gold chain, and a small book full of writing he could not read. He put the locket around his neck, as the men and women in the village did, and put the other things back in the cupboard. One day I shall read those strange words, he said to himself. It was time for Tarzan to go back to the village for more arrows. He waited all day in the tree above the pot of boiling liquid, but the woman did not leave it. As darkness fell, the workers returned from the fields. Then the warriors returned from the forest, carrying a struggling animal. When they came closer, Tarzan saw that they were carrying a man. The women and children beat him with sticks and stones and tied him to a wooden post. Tarzan was sad. How cruel my fellow men are, he thought. Even the wild animals kill their victims quickly. The people began to dance around the terrified man. I hope that they do not eat him alive, Tarzan thought. Apes do not do that. But the dance gave Tarzan the chance he wanted. He dropped to the ground and gathered up the arrows. But he wanted these people to know that he had been there. He slipped into one of the huts,
picked up a skull, and climbed into the tree. Then he hurled the skull into the group of people, and they ran about, shrieking with terror. As he made his way back to his tribe, Tarzan came face to face again with his enemy, Saber. Her great yellow eyes were fixed on him, and she licked her lips with longing. Tarzan did not try to escape. "Now I have a better weapon than a rope or a knife," he thought. He fired an arrow into Saber's top leg. With a roar, Saber charged again. Tarzan fired another arrow, and she fell to the ground dead. Tarzan placed a foot upon the body of his enemy and roared. The sound echoed through the forest, and the other animals crept away. None of them ever looked for trouble with the great white ape. When Tarzan returned to his tribe, he proudly carried Saber's skin. "Look what the mighty Tarzan has done!" he cried from the top of a tree. Kerchak was full of anger and envy. "Come down, Tarzan!" he shrieked. "Come down and feel my fangs! Great killers do not hide in trees." Quickly, Tarzan dropped to the ground. As Kerchak came roaring toward him, Tarzan met the attack with a blood-curdling roar. He grasped Kerchak's wrist and plunged his knife below his heart. The ape's teeth were only an inch from Tarzan's neck when he suddenly stiffened and fell down dead. Tarzan pulled out his knife, placed his foot on Kerchak's neck, and gave his ear-splitting cry of triumph. And so, the young Lord Greystoke became the King of the Apes.
Chapter 4. Tarzan Decides. There was one ape who did not accept Tarzan, Turquoise, the son of Tublat and Kala and Tarzan's ape brother. But he was afraid of Tarzan's knife and deadly arrows. The tribe was happy because Tarzan was an intelligent hunter. At night, he led them to the villagers' fields and stole their crops, while he stole more arrows. The villagers were afraid of the enemy they could not see. They moved further into the jungle to build a new village. Now the jungle was filled with men's voices. The great apes wanted to move away, but Tarzan hated the thought of leaving the little cabin. However, one day, the black men built their huts on the banks of the river where the apes drank. Tarzan led his tribe deeper into the jungle, but he still came back to the sea from time to time to steal arrows and read his books. He had one great fear, that these men would find his cabin. So Tarzan spent less and less time with his tribe. He was tired of being king. He longed to be alone in the cool house by the sea. "I have grown apart from my people," he thought. "I do not share their interests, and I cannot share all the wonderful things I have discovered in my books." But Tarzan was stubborn. "I shall not leave yet," he thought, "because Turquoise is waiting to become king in my place. No, I shall not run away from my enemy." One day, the matter was suddenly decided. The tribe was feeding quietly when Turquoise began to beat an old female ape. He knew that her husband was too weak to defend her. Tarzan warned him to stop, but Turquoise carried on. Tarzan threw himself upon his enemy. Never had he fought such a battle since that day he had fought Bolgani, the great gorilla. Soon they were rolling on the ground, tearing at each other. Tarzan of the Apes, the young Lord Greystoke, would have died except for one thing. He could think about what he would do next. As soon as Turquoise stopped to catch his breath, Tarzan climbed onto his back. There he was safe from those terrible fangs. Then he pulled Turquoise's arms behind his back and pulled him to the ground.
"I could break his neck easily," Tarzan thought. "But as long as he is alive, He will be an example to the other apes not to challenge me." "Kagoda?" Tarzan asked in their language. "Do you surrender?" "Kagoda!" his enemy shrieked. "Next time, I shall kill you," Tarzan said. "Do you understand?" "Huh," Turkos agreed. The apes went back to their feeding, but deep inside their minds, they knew that their king was a strange creature. He had had the power to kill his enemy, but he had allowed him to live. At dusk, as the tribe came together to sleep, Tarzan called the males to him. "You have seen today that Tarzan is great," he said. "But Tarzan is not an ape. He is not like his tribe. So he is going back to the house of his own people by the water. You must choose another king, because Tarzan will not return."
The following morning, Tarzan, limping and sore from his fight, set out for the sea. He reached the cabin the next day. His wounds slowly healed, leaving a terrible scar above his left eye, which ran down to his ear. "I must have clothes," Tarzan thought. "That is what will make me a man rather than an ape." From that day, Tarzan kept the skins and ornaments from the black warriors he killed. A bow and arrows hung from his shoulder, and a leather belt held his knife. The golden chain which held the locket hung around his neck. Tarzan hated the hair that had begun to grow on his face, like the apes had. He did not want to be like them, and so, with his knife, he learned to shave. He was a strange sight, strong and straight, a hunter, a warrior, but intelligence shone in his eyes. In all these ways, the young Lord Greystoke was taking the first steps toward the life that he wanted, to be like the men he had seen in his picture book. Chapter 5. His Own People. One day, as Tarzan was returning to his cabin, he saw something he had never seen before. A ship named the Arrow lay off the coast, and on the beach stood a small boat. White men were walking along the beach. They were like the pictures in his book, and like himself. Tarzan crept behind the trees to watch. There were 10 men, all talking loudly and shaking their fists. One of them, a small man with a face like a rat, put his hand on the shoulder of the tall man next to him. He pointed inland, and the man turned to look. The small man took out his revolver and shot him in the back. The sound of the shot amazed Tarzan, although he was not afraid. But he did not like the behavior of the men. "They are as cruel as the black warriors," he thought. Soon afterward, the men climbed into the boat and rowed back to the ship. Tarzan slipped into his cabin and found that it had been searched. Anger rose in him. He ran to the cupboard, took out the little metal box, and breathed a sigh of relief. The photograph of the smiling young man was safe, and the book with the strange writing. A loud noise made Tarzan look through the window. People were climbing from the big ship into small boats. Tarzan picked up a pencil and a piece of paper, wrote on it, and fixed it to the door of the cabin. Then, picking up his precious box, his arrows, and as many spears as he could carry, he disappeared into the forest. 5 people were brought ashore that day. An elderly man with white hair and spectacles named Professor Porter, his 19-year-old daughter named Jane, her companion and nurse Esmeralda, a tall young man dressed in white named Cecil Clayton, the son of John Clayton's younger brother, and Professor Porter's assistant, a fussy old man named Mr. Philander. The group walked in silence up to the cabin door and stared at this notice. "This is the house of Tarzan," they read. the killer of beasts. Tarzan is watching you. Tarzan of the Apes. Tarzan could not understand what the people were saying, but he saw that the rat-faced sailor was quarreling with the young man. As the two older men walked off into the jungle, the sailor pointed his revolver at him. The young woman screamed a warning. At the same time, a spear flew from the trees and hit the sailor in the right shoulder. He dropped his revolver and collapsed.
"Who threw that spear?"
Jane whispered to Clayton. "I am sure that Tarzan of the Apes is not very far away," he replied. "Take Esmeralda and lock yourselves inside the cabin while I find your father." When they were safely inside, Esmeralda searched for something to barricade the door. As she looked around the cabin for the first time, a shriek of terror rose to her lips. On the floor lay the whitened skeleton of a man. Then they saw the other on the bed, and the tiny one in the cradle.
"What horrible place have we come to?"
Jane whispered. Clayton picked up the spear and plunged into the jungle in search of his friends. The sailors took the boats and went back to the ship where they would be safe from the unseen spears. "I trust the men who have gone into the jungle," Tarzan thought, "but I do not trust the sailors." Tarzan's head was in a whirl with all the wonders he had seen that day. But the most wonderful sight had been the face of the beautiful young girl.